He was a university student, a husband, a father of a 6-month-old baby girl. And in the summer of 1989, behind the walls of Magnitogorsk's gray concrete apartment blocks, he became the last thing the Soviet Union would ever produce before it collapsed. A predator who hunted young girls in elevators, in stairwells, in the dark spaces between floors where no one could hear them scream. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover 3 disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. This story was created through many hours of careful research and dedicated storytelling. Every detail has been considered with the goal of honoring these events while providing an engaging and meaningful listening experience. Through this channel, these stories can continue to be remembered, shared, and preserved. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the liftman, the last monster the Soviet Union ever made. Dmitry Leonidovich Grydin, a.k.a. the liftman, a.k.a. the last maniac of the USSR. Now let's begin. There is a particular kind of evil that never announces itself. It does not growl. It does not linger in shadows wearing a face you would recognize as dangerous. It takes a wife. It studies at a respected university. It holds a baby in its arms. It smiles at neighbors in the corridor, presses the elevator button politely, and waits. That is exactly what made Dmitry Grydin so devastating. Not just what he did, but what he was while he did it. The city of Magnitogorsk, a steel-forged industrial giant built on Soviet ambition deep in the Chelyabinsk Oblast, had survived war, famine, and the slow grind of communist austerity. But in the summer of 1989, something crept through its housing blocks that none of its people had prepared for. A man who used the ordinary architecture of daily life as a hunting ground. Elevators, entryways, porch steps, the spaces every resident passed through every single day. He turned routine into a death sentence, and he did it wearing the face of an ordinary young man. By the time the city understood what was moving through its corridors, 3 young girls were already gone. This is the true story of Dmitry Grydin, the liftman, the last serial killer of the USSR. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Magnitogorsk is not a city that whispers. It is a city that roars. Situated near the southern edge of the Ural Mountains, it was built almost entirely around the Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works, one of the largest steel production facilities in the entire world. Smokestacks permanently bruised the sky. The air carried the metallic bite of industry. The city was engineered for output, for endurance, for production. It was a place where people worked hard and asked few questions, because asking too many questions had never served Soviet citizens well. Apartment blocks rose in rigid rows, uniform and gray, built for efficiency rather than warmth. Corridors were dim. Stairwells echoed. Elevators rattled and groaned between floors. In a city this size, nobody thought twice about a young man standing near an entryway. Nobody thought twice about a face they didn't immediately recognize. That anonymity, that industrial numbness would cost the city dearly. Dmitry Leonidovich Grydin was born in that city on the 4th of March, 1968, the son of a man who held a position of genuine authority at the Iron and Steel Works, heading one of its workshops. The Grydin family was not poor. They were not marginalized. They were, by every Soviet standard, respectable, comfortable, the kind of family other families in the bloc might have quietly envied. Young Dmitry grew up with that weight of expectation around him, a father who carried himself with the posture of a man whose work mattered, whose name meant something in the factory halls and the neighborhood streets surrounding them. He went on to study at the Magnitogorsk State Technical University. He was the product of the Soviet educational system, disciplined, structured, shaped by a society that believed in collective identity and individual function. He married. He had a daughter who was only 6 months old when the summer of 1989 arrived. From the outside, Dmitry Grydin was a young man on the right trajectory. A student, a husband, A new father navigating the early years of domestic life in a Soviet industrial city. There was nothing in his face that said monster. There was nothing in his daily routine that broadcast danger. And that, more than anything, is what would allow him to operate for as long as he did. But something existed beneath that surface. Something that did not match the apartment, the wife, the infant daughter, the university lectures. Something that had been building quietly, invisibly, and by July of 1989 it was ready to come out. The summer of 1989 was a complicated season for the Soviet Union. The empire was straining under Gorbachev's reforms. Glasnost had cracked open years of suppressed tension. Across the USSR, things that had never been spoken aloud were starting to surface. The society was distracted, its attention pulled in the direction of political upheaval, economic anxiety, and the slow realization that the system many had trusted their entire lives was beginning to fracture. In Magnitogorsk, people went about their lives the way they always had, reporting to shifts, queuing for bread, riding elevators up and down the same gray towers they had lived in for decades. Nobody was watching the stairwells. Nobody was tracking who entered which building when. And Dmitry Grydin had noticed that. He had been watching the buildings. Not in a conspicuous way, not in any way that drew attention. He had been paying attention to the patterns of the people around him. When girls came home, which entrances they used. How quickly they moved from the street to the door, whether they were alone. He had been calculating, in the particular cold and methodical way that distinguishes a predator from a man simply suffering through dark impulses. There is a difference between a person overwhelmed by a violent compulsion in a single moment and a person who scouts locations, times his movements, and selects his targets with deliberate precision. Grydin was the latter. The liftman did not operate on impulse alone. He operated on patience. On the 31st of July, 1989, the patience ended. Her name was Jana Taranchuk. She was 16 years old. 16, the age at which a person is still more child than adult, still moving through the world with the specific vulnerability of youth, still trusting that the familiar streets of home are safe. She was on the porch of her own house when Grydin reached her. The porch, not a dark alley, not an isolated field on the outskirts of the city, but the entrance to her own home. The place that should have been the threshold of safety, the final step before she was inside and secure. That is where Dmitry Grydin chose to strike. The details of what he did to Jana Taranchuk are as brutal as they are devastating. He attacked her, raped her, and killed her. The ferocity of the assault bore the marks of someone who had restrained something for a very long time. This was not hesitant. This was not the stumbling violence of a first-time criminal unsure of his own nerve. The attack on Jana Taranchuk carried with it a terrifying fluency, as though what was happening had already lived many times inside his mind before his hands made it real. When it was over, Grydin walked away. He went back to his apartment, back to his wife, his infant daughter, his university coursework, his father's respectable name. And the city of Magnitogorsk woke the next morning to the discovery of a 16-year-old girl who would never come home again. The investigation that followed was constrained by the realities of Soviet-era policing. Resources were not what they would be in a modern forensic environment. There were no digital databases, no sophisticated profiling units, no immediate cross-referencing of evidence across a centralized system. Investigators worked with what they had: witness accounts, physical evidence gathered at the scene, and the testimonies of anyone who might have noticed something near the entrance to Jana's building. The problem was that nobody had. Or if anyone had, they did not connect what they saw to what had happened. A young man near a building entrance was not a remarkable sight in Magnitogorsk. It was simply life. What investigators did gather was a general understanding that the attack had been sexual in nature and that it appeared premeditated. A 16-year-old girl had been chosen, followed, and killed with a violence that suggested whoever was responsible had not acted on sudden opportunity alone. But without a face, without a name, without a clear witness who had observed the attacker in connection with the crime, the investigation stalled in the way that so many Soviet-era investigations did. Buried under bureaucratic process, limited by a law enforcement system that was better equipped for dealing with dissidents than hunting predators. Gryden went on living his life. In the weeks that followed Jana's murder, reports began reaching police from other women and girls across the city. The pattern was specific enough to be alarming. Females had been approached, grabbed, or cornered in the entryways and elevator shafts of residential apartment buildings. Some had escaped. Some had fought back hard enough to cause their attacker to retreat. But the descriptions were emerging. A young man, average build, operating in the residential corridors and stairwells of Magnitogorsk's apartment blocks. He had not succeeded in killing again yet, but he had tried, multiple times. And in each failed attempt, he had simply melted back into the crowd and disappeared. It was during this period that police began assembling a clearer image of who they were dealing with. One of his failed victims managed to provide investigators with a detailed physical description. She had looked at him. She had committed his face to memory with the sharp and desperate clarity that comes from surviving something that could have been fatal. Her description was precise enough to be significant. The investigators gave the unknown attacker a name, not his real one, but a descriptive one, born from the locations of his attacks. They called him the lift man, the elevator man, the one who moved through stairwells and lift shafts the way other people moved through rooms, as though those in-between transitional spaces were his natural territory. That nickname would spread through Magnitogorsk like frost. Women stopped riding elevators alone. Mothers warned their daughters. Girls traveled in pairs, glanced over their shoulders, hurried through entryways with their keys already out. The city was afraid in the specific, domestic way that is hardest to bear. Afraid not of something far away, but of something that lived inside the ordinary routine of daily life. The elevator was no longer just a machine. It had become a possible coffin. And the man the city feared was, at that very moment, changing his daughter's nappies and attending university lectures. A month after the murder of Jana Taranchuk, Gryden struck again. This time, not once but twice. The names of his next two victims were Danzili Usmanova and Ludmila Pozniakova. Both killed in the same period. Both assaulted with the same savage pattern, cornered in or near residential buildings, attacked sexually and murdered. The killings carried the same signature of controlled, calculated violence, the same geography of entryways and corridors, the same targeting of young females who were simply trying to get home. At one of the murder sites, Gryden made his first verifiable mistake. He left a fingerprint. It was a single print. Physical evidence of a physical presence at the scene of a killing. In a modern forensic environment, that print would have been processed rapidly and cross-referenced against a national database. In the Soviet Union of 1989, the process was slower, but it was there. It existed. The liftman, for all his calculated patience, had touched something he should not have touched, and the surface he had pressed his finger against had held the record of it faithfully. That print would become one of the most important pieces of evidence the investigation would ever gather. The city's fear deepened after the second and third murders. 3 young girls dead. Others attacked and escaped. A predator who knew the residential architecture of Magnitogorsk as intimately as a rat knows the inside of its own walls. Police were under enormous pressure. The people of the city were not simply afraid, they were furious. This was the Soviet Union, a state that had built its entire political identity on the premise of collective safety, on the assurance that the party and its institutions kept its citizens protected. A serial predator killing young girls in elevators was not just a crime. It was a rupture in the social contract that the state had written for itself. The rage of Magnitogorsk's residents was as much political as it was personal. Investigators continued building the case quietly, working with the fingerprint evidence, working with the survivor descriptions, and continuing to map the geography of the attacks. All of them fell within a specific radius. All of them followed the same pattern. All of them shared the same signature of a man who understood how to use the architecture of Soviet residential life as cover, as camouflage, as a hunting ground. The profile was narrowing. The net was tightening, though Dmitry Gryden did not yet know it. He would try again in November, and that attempt would be the one that destroyed him. November in the Chelyabinsk Oblast is not a forgiving season. By the time the calendar reaches the final weeks of autumn, the cold has already settled into the kind of permanent, bone-reaching chill that transforms the city into something stark and merciless. The temperatures can plunge to 20 degrees below zero. The streets empty earlier. People move faster, heads down, scarves pulled tight, gloved hands shoved deep into coat pockets. The city compresses into itself against the cold. And in that compression, in the thinned-out streets and the urgency of frozen air, anyone who stood still too long, anyone who loitered without purpose, became visible in a way that summer crowds never allowed. Dmitry Grydin did not account for that. Or perhaps he did account for it and believed his nerve would carry him through regardless. Either way, on the 25th of November 1989, he made his move again. He identified a target, another young girl, another residential entryway, another attempt to repeat what he had already done 3 times before. But this time, the victim did not freeze. This time, the girl he reached for did not become silent with terror or collapse under the shock of his attack. She fought back. With everything she had, with every gram of strength and fury that a young woman fighting for her life could summon, she resisted him. The struggle was loud and physical and completely contrary to what Grydin had expected. She did not comply. She did not succumb. She fought, and Grydin ran. He fled into the street, into the frozen Magnitogorsk night, into air so cold it burned the lungs on contact. He was running at -20 degrees Celsius, and in his panic, in the sheer blind urgency of getting away, he lost 2 things that would seal his fate: his hat and his glasses. Those 2 objects, left behind on the freezing street, seem almost comically mundane for items that would end the career of a serial killer. But context is everything. In a city where the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, a man walking without a hat or glasses was not simply underdressed. He was conspicuous in the most extreme way possible. Every person on those streets was bundled in every layer they owned. Every face was wrapped and covered. A man moving quickly through the cold with no head covering and no glasses was a man who had, very visibly, just lost both of those things somewhere nearby and was now trying to get away from where he'd lost them. Officers in the area responded swiftly. The girl had raised the alarm. The description matched the profile they had been building for months. The liftman, the same man who had killed 3 girls and evaded every sweep the police had conducted since July. And now he was running through the streets of Magnitogorsk without his hat or glasses in -20-degree weather, standing out against the bundled crowd like something raw and exposed. They caught him. When officers detained Dmitry Leonidovich Grydin that night, they found a knife on him. Not hidden in his home, not concealed somewhere he could deny access to, on his person, in the immediate moment of his capture. A knife, the tool of the predator, carried into the night with a girl to find and a purpose to fulfill. The evidence of what he was and what he had intended was right there, in his coat, undeniable. The arrest sent a shockwave through Magnitogorsk that few events in the city's history had managed to produce. The liftman, the shadow that had haunted elevators and stairwells for months, the face behind the nickname that had kept women off residential corridors after dark, had a real identity now. He was a university student. He was married. He had a baby daughter. He was the son of a respected man who worked at the iron and steel works. He was 21 years old. The revelation landed on the city with a particular terrible weight. This was not a stranger from outside. This was not someone who had drifted in from another place carrying chaos on his back. Dmitry Grydin had grown up in Magnitogorsk. He had studied there. He had built a family there. He had walked those same streets that every other resident walked, ridden those same elevators, stood in those same entryways, and he had used every inch of that familiar landscape to kill. The community's reaction was volcanic. People who had been afraid became enraged. The fear that had sent women home in pairs and kept children off the streets turned inside out and became something furious and loud and demanding. Residents gathered. Voices rose. The prevailing sentiment in Magnitogorsk was not that the courts should handle this carefully and with measured due process. The prevailing sentiment was that Dmitry Grydin should be executed publicly, without delay, and that the execution should be witnessed by the city he had terrorized. The anger was not abstract. It was specific, righteous, and enormous. During the investigation that followed his arrest, Gryden was confronted with the fingerprint evidence gathered from one of the murder scenes. The print was his. The survivor descriptions matched his physical appearance. The failed attack on the night of his arrest had a witness, the girl who had fought back and survived. The knife found on his person connected him directly to an attack in progress. The geography of all the murders and attempted assaults traced directly back to a man who lived in that city and knew those buildings intimately. Under the weight of all of that, the investigation moved toward Gryden's confession. But the circumstances of how that confession was obtained would become a controversy that followed the case for decades. Gryden would later claim, consistently, insistently, for the rest of his time in custody, that he was forced to incriminate himself. That the confession extracted from him during the investigation was not freely given but coerced through the methods that Soviet and early Russian interrogations were historically known to employ. He maintained this claim through every parole hearing, every appeal, every interview he would give from his prison cell over the following 3 decades. The courts, however, established the case against him through multiple streams of evidence that went far beyond the confession alone. The fingerprint, the survivor testimony, the knife, the circumstances of his flight and capture, the pattern of the crimes mapping precisely onto his movements and knowledge of the city. The forensic and testimonial record assembled by investigators was substantive enough that the verdict, when it came, was not a close call. The trial began in autumn of 1990. By that point, Magnitogorsk had been living with the knowledge of what Gryden had done for nearly a year. The city had processed its fear, moved through its anger, and arrived at a demand, a loud, public, sustained demand, for the harshest possible sentence. People gathered outside the courthouse. They protested in the streets surrounding the proceedings. They called for execution. They called for justice in the bluntest, most visceral terms, and they called for it loudly enough that the authorities could not pretend not to hear them. On the 3rd of October 1990, the Chelyabinsk Regional Court sentenced Dmitry Leonidovich Gryden to death. The city had asked for it. The court had delivered it. And for a period, it appeared that the Liftman story would end at the barrel of a gun in a Soviet execution chamber, which would have made him, in the grim arithmetic of the era, simply another name on the list of serial killers the USSR had dispatched with a bullet. But history intervened. Russia was changing. The Soviet Union that had produced Gryden, that had tried him, that had sentenced him to death, ceased to exist in December of 1991, just over a year after his sentencing. The country that emerged from its collapse was a different place, navigating its entry into international institutions that carried expectations around human rights, due process, and the abolition of capital punishment. Russia joined the Council of Europe. Commitments were made. And in December of 1993, the death sentence handed down to Dmitry Gryden was commuted. He would not be shot. He would live. His new sentence was life imprisonment. He was transferred to Ogneny Ostrov, Fire Island, a facility in the Vologda Oblast housing some of Russia's most serious convicted criminals. It was there that the liftman would remain as the decades accumulated around him, as the Soviet Union became a memory and its last maniac settled into the gray, endless routine of a man who would never be free. The city he had terrorized moved on. New generations were born in Magnitogorsk who had no personal memory of the fear that had emptied its elevators in the summer and autumn of 1989. The apartment blocks that had been his hunting grounds aged and weathered. The iron and steel works continued to burn. And in a colony in Vologda Oblast, Dmitry Gryden continued to breathe. There is a particular arrogance that belongs to a certain kind of criminal, the ones who, having been caught, convicted, and imprisoned, spend the remainder of their lives insisting the system got it wrong. Not out of genuine innocence, but out of the same refusal to accept consequence that drove the original crime. They move through incarceration the way they moved through their violence, on their own terms, by their own logic, in a reality that they alone seem to inhabit. Dmitry Gryden was precisely this kind of man. From the very beginning of his imprisonment, Gryden refused to accept the verdict. He did not admit guilt. He did not offer the kind of reckoning that the families of Jana Taranchuk, Danzili Usmanova, and Ludmila Pozniakova deserved. Instead, he filed complaints. He launched appeals. He constructed an alternative account of himself, a man wrongly accused, wrongly convicted, coerced into incriminating himself by an investigation that had needed a guilty party and selected him for the role. He was consistent in this narrative. Relentlessly, almost impressively consistent. Over years, over decades, never changed. The story was always the same, that Dmitry Grydin was the victim of a flawed system, not the perpetrator of 3 murders. The first major legal challenge came in 2000, over a decade into his imprisonment, when Grydin filed an appeal with the United Nations Human Rights Committee. This was not a small gesture. Taking a case to the UN required legal assistance, required the construction of an argument, required the patience and strategic thinking of a man who, if nothing else, had nothing but time. The committee examined the case and returned a finding that acknowledged there had been procedural violations during the investigation. This was, in the narrow technical sense, a meaningful finding. Violations of procedure are not nothing. They matter in a justice system that takes its own rules seriously. But the Russian government's response was unambiguous. They refused to release him. The argument the Russian leadership advanced was direct and almost brutally simple. After Grydin's arrest in November 1989, the attacks on women in Magnitogorsk stopped. Not reduced, not lessened, stopped entirely. The pattern that had terrorized the city for 5 months. The elevator ambushes, the stairwell attacks, the escalating violence against young females in residential building corridors, ceased the moment Dmitry Grydin was in custody. That cessation was treated as evidence in itself. Whatever procedural irregularities might have existed in the investigation, the outcome of his imprisonment had been, empirically, the end of the attacks. The Russian authorities refused to separate those two facts, and in refusing to separate them, effectively told the United Nations that they did not care about its finding in practical terms. Grydin remained in Ogneny Ostrov. The years moved the way they do for men serving life sentences in Russian maximum security facilities. Slowly, with a particular weight. The colony on Fire Island was not a comfortable place. Russian penal facilities of that category operated under conditions that international human rights organizations had documented extensively. Overcrowding, limited resources, the harsh physical environment of the Vologda Oblast where winter arrived early and stayed long. The men imprisoned there were not serving time in any softened sense of the phrase. They were contained within a system that had been designed, among other things, as a form of ongoing punishment. And yet Grydin endured. He wrote legal arguments. He appealed. He studied the mechanisms of the system that held him and tried repeatedly to find the gap through which he might escape it. This was not repentance. This was not a man hollowed out by guilt or reconstructed by remorse. This was the same cold, methodical intelligence that had operated in Magnitogorsk's apartment blocks in 1989, now redirected toward the legal machinery of Russian courts, toward parole boards and presidential pardon offices and appeal structures, toward any avenue that might eventually open a door. In 2013, the television program Investigation Conducted sent a crew to visit Grydin in the Vologda Oblast colony. It was one of the rare occasions on which his face and voice entered Russian public consciousness after the trial of 1990. He was interviewed on camera. He was, by this point, 45 years old, no longer the 21-year-old student whose arrest had caused Magnitogorsk to erupt in fury. He had the look of a man who had been inside for a very long time, contained, careful, measuring every word. He announced during that interview that he intended to apply for parole in 2014, 25 years after his arrest. He spoke about his years of imprisonment without serious violations. He spoke as though the years of compliance should function as currency, as though time served without incident was a form of transaction that should result in freedom. The people who watched that interview, particularly those old enough to remember the summer of 1989 in Magnitogorsk, did not receive it as he apparently intended. In 2014, Grydin challenged the presidential decree on his pardon through the courts. The application was refused. He challenged the refusal. The Supreme Court of Russia left the ruling unchanged. Later that same year, formally and through the appropriate legal channels, he filed a motion for conditional early release. The mechanism known in Russian law as UDO. The Belozersky District Court, the court responsible for the facility in which he was held, refused. 3 years later, in the summer of 2017, he filed the motion again. The court refused again. He appealed to the Vologda Regional Court. That appeal was rejected. By the time the 2021 news cycle briefly returned his name to public attention, when it was reported that Grydin had been denied parole again and remained imprisoned, he had served more than 30 years. He had never admitted guilt. He had never offered the specific kind of acknowledgement that the families of 3 murdered girls were owed. He had pursued every legal avenue available to him with persistence, but he had not, in any of those pursuits, turned to face what he had actually done. What is particularly haunting about this phase of the Grydin story is the 3 names that are never at the center of it. The legal filings and the UN appeals and the TV interview and the parole hearings, all of these proceedings were structured around Dmitry Grydin. His rights, his procedural violations, his years of good behavior, his intentions going forward, his desire to live outside the walls. The legal architecture of the case, as it stretched across the decades, was built almost entirely around the man who committed the murders rather than the girls who were murdered. Zhana Taranchuk was 16 when she died on the porch of her own home on the 31st of July, 1989. Danzili Usmanova and Ludmila Pozniakova were killed in the month that followed. 3 young females whose entire futures, every experience, every relationship, every ordinary and extraordinary moment of life they might have had, were cancelled by a man who had decided his compulsions mattered more than their existence. Their names are rarely spoken in the legal documents and news reports and parole hearings that surround the Grydin case. They appear, when they appear at all, as a list, as the established count of his victims, as the evidence of his crime, rather than as the humans whose lives were stolen. Grydin's insistence on his own innocence across more than 3 decades of imprisonment has the effect of compounding that erasure. Each time he argued in front of a board or a court that he was the wronged party in this story, each time he constructed a legal argument around his own mistreatment, the girls he killed were pushed further from the center of their own story. That displacement, quiet, bureaucratic, almost invisible, is its own form of cruelty. The city of Magnitogorsk rebuilt itself around the memory and the absence of what happened in 1989. A generation that was too young to remember the fear grew up in the same apartment buildings, rode the same types of elevators, passed through the same kinds of entryways. The stairwells were just stairwells again. The elevators were just elevators. The city made its steel and burned its fires, and the population moved through their days without the particular terror that had gripped it in the summer and autumn of the year the Soviet Union began its final collapse. But there are women in Magnitogorsk who still remember not riding elevators alone. There are people who were young in 1989 who still feel the specific body-level fear that the nickname Liftman produced in them then, the sudden terrible awareness of every enclosed space between the street and their own front door. Memory of that kind does not fully leave. It lives in the body long after the mind has moved on. And in Ogneny Ostrov, on Fire Island in the Vologda Oblast, the man who produced that fear continued to breathe and argue and file motions and insist on his own version of events. To understand what Dmitry Grydin became across 30-plus years of imprisonment, it is necessary to understand something about the nature of the system that held him. Russian maximum security penal colonies of the special regime category are among the most isolating custodial environments in the developed world. Ogneny Ostrov, Fire Island, sits in the Belozersky district of the Vologda Oblast, in a region where the geography itself reinforces the concept of containment. The Vologda Oblast is a vast, cold, heavily forested territory deep in northwestern Russia. Getting to it requires intention. Getting away from it, for someone without permission, would be nearly impossible even without walls or guards. The facility holds life-sentenced prisoners, men convicted of the most serious crimes in the Russian criminal code, and it does so in conditions that are not designed for comfort, rehabilitation, or any expectation of return to society. Grydin entered that world at 22 years old, carrying a death sentence that would be commuted before he had fully settled into the reality of his captivity. By the time the sentence changed to life imprisonment, He had presumably understood that the doors around him were not temporary, that the years ahead of him were not a passage towards something on the other side, but simply years, accumulating, unending, stretching into a future that ended whenever it ended without freedom. What he did with that understanding was, in its own twisted way, extraordinary. He did not collapse. He did not descend into the kind of institutional passivity that long-term imprisonment often produces. The slow erosion of agency, the abandonment of forward planning, the loss of a self that can be meaningfully projected beyond the walls. Gryden remained, by all accounts of those who interacted with him, alert, engaged, purposeful. He directed his purpose toward one goal, and he pursued that goal with a consistency that spanned decades. Getting out. His appeals were not scattershot. They were structured. The 2000 UN Human Rights Committee case required him to understand international human rights law well enough to construct a case worth examining. The presidential pardon challenge of 2014 required navigating the specific mechanisms of Russian executive and judicial authority. The UDO motions of 2014 and 2017 required familiarity with the specific legal standards applied by Russian courts in evaluating parole eligibility for life-sentence prisoners. Standards that included assessment of the prisoner's behavior inside the facility, the nature of the original offense, and the perceived risk to society upon release. On the question of behavior, Gryden had a legitimate argument. He had served over 25 years, then over 30 years, without serious violations of the detention regime. In many justice systems across the world, this would be considered significant. It would be weighed meaningfully against the original offense. The idea behind parole eligibility is not simply the punitive one. It includes the possibility that a person who committed a serious crime in early adulthood has, decades later, become a fundamentally different individual, one who represents a manageable risk if returned to society under supervision. The Russian courts, in Gryden's case, declined to accept this framing. The Belozersky District Court's refusals in 2014 and 2017 both rested on a finding that Gryden did not always comply with the requirements of the detention regime, not that he had committed serious violations, but that his compliance was inconsistent enough to undermine the argument that he had become a reliably reformed individual. There is a difference, in the language of Russian parole jurisprudence, between a prisoner who has simply avoided serious trouble and a prisoner who demonstrates the consistent, sustained compliance that suggests genuine rehabilitation. The court found that Gryden sat in the first category rather than the second. But beyond the technical compliance question, there was a deeper issue that the courts never fully stated in their rulings but that ran beneath every decision like a current. Gryden had not admitted his guilt. He had not, in any of his 3 decades of imprisonment, turned to face what the evidence had established he had done and said, "Yes, I did this. I killed Zhana Taranchuk on the porch of her home. I killed Danzili Usmanova. I killed Ludmila Pozniakova. I was the liftman and I am responsible for what the liftman did and I am sorry." That acknowledgement never came. Not in the trial. Not in the subsequent appeals. Not in the TV interview of 2013. Not in any of the parole hearings. Gryden maintained, through every one of those proceedings, that he was innocent, that the investigation had coerced him, that the verdict had been wrong, that the system had failed him. In a man who had never admitted guilt, the question of rehabilitation becomes extraordinarily complicated. How does one assess the rehabilitation of a person who insists there was nothing to rehabilitate from? How does a court weigh the journey from violence to reform when the person before it refuses to acknowledge that the violence ever occurred? The Russian courts answered that question consistently. They denied parole. And then there is the matter of the stopped attacks. The Russian government's argument, advanced in response to the UN Human Rights Committee's finding of procedural violations, was elemental in its simplicity. After Gryden's arrest, the attacks on women and girls in Magnitogorsk's residential buildings ceased. This was not a correlation that could easily be dismissed. The pattern had been specific enough that investigators had created a profile and a nickname. The attacks had a consistent signature. They had a geography. They had a victim type. They had a method. And they stopped on the 25th of November 1989, the night Gryden was caught. The cessation was not a coincidence that the courts were willing to ignore, regardless of the procedural questions around the confession. The evidence that had been gathered, the fingerprint, the survivor descriptions, the knife found on Gryden at the time of his arrest, provided a foundation for the conviction that did not rest solely on the contested confession. The procedural violations acknowledged by the UN were real, and they mattered in a principles of justice sense. But the evidential record assembled around Gryden was substantive enough that the Russian system treated the conviction as sound. Whether Dmitry Gryden is guilty precisely as convicted, or whether any aspect of the case carries genuine uncertainty, is a question the Russian courts have examined multiple times and answered consistently in the same direction. The guilt has been upheld. The sentence has been upheld. The parole has been denied. The appeal to the Supreme Court was denied. Every door that existed in the Russian legal system for a life-sentence prisoner to open, Gryden tried. None of them opened. There is a particular image that emerges from the 2013 television interview that is difficult to shake. A man in his mid-40s, imprisoned for nearly a quarter of a century, sitting in a facility deep in the Vologda Oblast and discussing his plans for parole applications. Measured, focused, still directing his intelligence toward the problem of his own freedom. Still refusing to offer the admission that the 3 dead girls deserved. Still constructing himself, for the camera and the audience and presumably for his own benefit, as the wronged party in a story in which he was, by every established measure, the perpetrator. The families of Zhana Taranchuk, Danzili Usmanova, and Ludmila Pozniakova have lived with a different kind of ongoing sentence. The one that grief imposes, the one that does not come with walls or a release date but simply continues, year after year, reorganizing itself around the permanent absence of the people they lost. Zhana was 16. The other 2 were young girls taken in the same brutal manner. Whatever futures they might have built, the careers, the relationships, the children of their own they might have raised, the ordinary days that make up a human life, were cancelled on the same short calendar of July through November 1989. Gryden's ongoing imprisonment has not given those families back anything they lost. It has not restored what was taken, but it has ensured that the man who took it has remained unable to do so again. And in the grim, unsatisfying calculation of what justice can and cannot actually do for those who have suffered this kind of loss, that is the best the system ever had to offer them. The nickname, the Lift Man, is the thing that has persisted most durably. It appears in Russian-language crime documentation, in true crime content, in discussions of Soviet-era serial killers, in the historical record of what Magnitogorsk's residents endured in 1989. The Lift Man, the man who turned elevators into sites of terror. The man who used the transitional spaces of ordinary apartment life as a hunting ground. The name carries everything the case contains. The specific dread of enclosed spaces, the violation of the familiar, the terrible truth that the most dangerous person in a building is sometimes the one who belongs there. He is also called the last maniac of the USSR. That title carries its own terrible weight. Not because there were no serious criminals after him in Russia, there were many and some of far greater scale, but because the timing of his case placed it at the exact historical seam between one world and another. He committed his crimes in 1989. He was tried in 1990. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. His death sentence was commuted when Russia abolished capital punishment in 1993. He spent his subsequent decades imprisoned in a country that was no longer the one that had produced him, tried him, or sentenced him. A country that was reinventing itself around him while he remained frozen in the amber of a crime committed in a world that no longer existed. The last maniac of the USSR is still alive. Born on the 4th of March, 1968, Dmitry Leonidovich Gryden is, as of 2026, 58 years old. He has spent more than half his life inside a maximum security penal colony in northwestern Russia. He has never admitted guilt. He has never stopped pursuing release. He carries a knife he was caught with on a frozen street in November 1989 as a permanent part of his legal history. Physical proof of a purpose he was pursuing on the night that last victim fought back and gave him no choice but to run. 3 girls. A city paralyzed by fear. A man who looked like everyone else and moved through the architecture of ordinary life as though it had been built for his purposes. A Soviet Union so distracted by its own impending collapse that it took months to close the net around a predator living in plain sight. A trial that became a public spectacle of rage. A death sentence commuted by history. A life imprisonment that Gryden has spent arguing against from the inside, with every legal tool available to him, without ever offering the one thing the case has always lacked: an honest accounting from the man who committed it. The elevators of Magnitogorsk rise and fall. The city makes its steel. The Vologda forest stands in its cold silence around Fire Island. And somewhere behind those walls, the last maniac of the USSR grows older, refusing to admit what everyone already knows. The liftman never stopped being the liftman. He simply ran out of floors to hunt on. If you're new here, welcome. This is a channel where true crime is told with calm and care. A huge thank you to the subscribers who've been here from the start. Your support means everything. If you're still watching, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from, or just say hello. And if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story. Now let's get into our second story. Story 2. The Monster Who Smiled at Funerals. The Václav Mrazek case, aka the bicycle predator of Komutov. He had a family, a job, and a warm bed to come home to, and every single morning, he woke up deciding which woman he was going to destroy next. There is a particular kind of evil that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look wild-eyed, doesn't speak in riddles, doesn't haunt the edges of your nightmares with a disfigured face or a theatrical snarl. No, the worst of them sit beside you on a bus. They hold the door open. They nod politely. They ride their bicycle through quiet forest roads in post-war Czechoslovakia, scanning the tree line for a lone woman, a girl, anyone walking without witness, without warning, without a chance. For 5 uninterrupted years between 1951 and 1956, while the dust of World War II was still settling over a broken continent, one man transformed the forests and back roads of the Komutov region into a graveyard of his own private making. He was unremarkable in nearly every physical sense. Short, thin-voiced, so ordinary that investigators literally theorized his attacker might have been a woman. He was a father. He had a partner. He held a steady job. And at night, or on quiet afternoons when the mood struck him, Václav Mrazek mounted his bicycle, tucked a loaded Walther PP into his possession, and went hunting. Before it was over, 7 women and girls were dead. 14 rapes were proven. 127 crimes in total filled the pages of a criminal file that stretched across 16 volumes. And Czechoslovakia, an entire country, had been held in suspended dread, not knowing that the man they were searching for was living quietly among them, going to work each morning, laughing at dinner, and sleeping soundly through the night. To understand what Václav Mrazek became, you first have to follow him back to the place that built him. A small, forgettable village called Svinarov, tucked into the folds of Czechoslovakia, where poverty was not an occasional visitor but a permanent resident. He was born on October 22, 1925, the 7th or 8th child in a family of 12, though 4 of those siblings never survived long enough to grow into people. The family that remained was bound together not by warmth or stability, but by shared deprivation. His father was a miner, rough-handed, short-tempered, and enslaved to alcohol in the way that men of that era and circumstance often were. He drank heavily, and when the drink settled into his blood, he turned violent. The children knew the sound of his footsteps. The wife knew better than to speak too loudly. The household was a pressure chamber, and young Václav absorbed every ounce of its damage. Food was not guaranteed. There were stretches where meals were simply absent, where the family's hunger became a physical weight rather than a passing inconvenience. At one particularly desperate point, the Mrazek family did not sleep in a house at all. They slept in a railroad car, pressed against one another in a rusted steel shell, with the cold seeping in through the joints and the smell of poverty hanging over everything like a permanent fog. It was here, in this environment of chaos, want, and violence, that Václav's character was shaped. Not guided, not nurtured, but hammered into a particular form the way raw metal is hammered. Through force, through heat, and without any consideration for what the finished product might do when it cooled. His education ended in the 5th grade of primary school. There was no further schooling, no structured path, no teacher who pulled him aside and saw potential worth developing. What there was, instead, was his mother. She was not cruel in the way his father was, but she was pragmatic in a fashion that left marks of its own. With her knowledge, with her tacit approval, young Václav and his brother Karel began stealing. Not dramatically, not with weapons or masks, but the everyday theft of survival, food, clothing, small household items. It was his mother's way of managing the household deficit, and it worked in the same way that all morally corrosive shortcuts work. It solved the immediate problem and quietly dismantled something essential in the boy doing it. His father went further. He didn't just permit the stealing. He made Václav teach his younger siblings how to do it properly. A father instructing his son in the craft of theft. A childhood spent learning that what you could not earn, you took. That people's things were simply resources waiting to be claimed by whoever was bold enough to reach for them. The line between a person's possessions and a person's body is, for some minds, terrifyingly thin. For Mrazek, it would eventually vanish altogether. In 1941, he was caught. He was 16 years old, lifted for one of the thefts that had by then become routine, and given a conditional sentence that resulted in 18 months of imprisonment. He went in a teenage thief. He came out with a criminal record, a heightened sense of social rejection, and a new ambition, one that, in its own way, reveals everything about the psychological architecture forming beneath the surface. When Mrazek was released, he wanted to become a police officer, or a soldier. He yearned genuinely for the authority that came with a uniform, for the power that was institutionally granted rather than personally seized. He applied. He was refused. The reason was almost comedically cruel in its mundanity. He was too short. His stature, slight and unimpressive, disqualified him from the roles that would have given him sanctioned power over others. So he found another path. In 1946, he enlisted as an armed escort for a humanitarian convoy traveling to Romania and Bulgaria. What he experienced on that convoy would later be described by Mrazek himself in ways that make the skin crawl, not because of what he was forced to witness, but because of what he chose to absorb and keep. He claimed that the soldiers on the convoy were constantly looting the humanitarian supplies, stealing goods meant for the starving, and trading them in exchange for sexual services of every kind. He claimed they fired weapons from the moving train at living things simply because they could. He described this environment not with horror or disgust, but with a kind of careful attention, the way someone memorizes an experience they intend to replicate. He was not traumatized by what he saw. He was educated by it. The gun, he later admitted, gave him something he had never felt before, a subtle, specific sense of superiority. Holding a weapon over someone else changed the architecture of the moment. It reorganized the hierarchy of a room. The small, overlooked, twice-imprisoned son of a drunken miner suddenly became the most powerful force in the immediate space. He replayed those moments on the convoy obsessively in his mind, turning them over and over, squeezing pleasure from the memory of domination. From there, it was a short road to sadistic literature. He began consuming pornographic material of a specifically brutal nature, material that centered on control, immobilization, suffering. His sexual psychology was, by the time he reached adulthood, already catastrophically warped. He admitted later, with a candor that chills rather than clarifies, that the greatest source of excitement for him was not intimacy, but stillness. He said watching a body collapse to the ground after being shot felt better to him than anything else. He tried, at one point, to break into a morgue. He wanted to be alone with the dead. When investigators eventually reconstructed his psychology, what emerged was the portrait of a man whose desire for control had completely eclipsed any capacity for genuine human connection, and who had found in death, specifically the death he himself caused, the only form of satisfaction that registered. None of this was visible on the surface. That is the detail that demands your full attention, because it is the detail that made him so extraordinarily dangerous for so long. In daily life, Václav Mrazek was, by almost every account, thoroughly unremarkable. His romantic partners described him as average. One found him slightly repulsive, not for his violence or his darkness, which they did not know about, but for his thriftiness, his obsessive reluctance to spend money, a residual tremor from a childhood where every coin was a survival tool. He was a football fan. He liked ice hockey. He cycled regularly, which, as we will see, was not a hobby but a method. He had a long-term partner. He had children with her. He went to work. He came home. He was, by every exterior measure, a functioning member of society, which is precisely the kind of camouflage that serial killers rely upon, and which post-war Czechoslovakia was particularly ill-equipped to see through. The country in 1951 was still reorganizing itself after the devastation of the war, and the communist takeover of 1948 had gutted the existing police infrastructure in a particularly damaging way. Experienced pre-war detectives, men who had developed real investigative instinct and procedural skill over decades of practice, had been systematically purged from the force after 1948, replaced with personnel selected primarily for their political reliability rather than their investigative competence. The result was a police force that was ideologically sound and professionally hollow, one that prioritized loyalty to the party over the skill of catching criminals. This institutional weakness would allow Václav Mrazek to operate freely for 5 years, across dozens of crimes, while investigators stumbled through leads and came up empty again and again. By the time Mrazek's darkness was fully ripened, he had a ritual. He cycled. He moved through the roads and forest paths of the Komutov region on his bicycle, a small, quiet, ordinary-looking man pedaling at an ordinary pace, scanning the road ahead with eyes that carried none of the ordinary thoughts that should have been behind them. He was looking for solitude, not his own, theirs. He was looking for a woman walking alone, or a girl sitting unattended in a field, or a figure on a path too remote to produce a witness in time. He later admitted that the sight of a lone woman triggered something in him that he described as a compulsion so intense it produced physical pain, a pressure headache so severe that he felt it could only be relieved by acting on it. He was not describing this as an excuse. He offered it plainly, the way someone describes a medical fact, which perhaps is the most disturbing part of the confession, the calm with which he acknowledged his own monstrousness. The first documented murder happened on August 22, 1951. The victim was 15 years old. Her name was Hanna Klebova, and she was in the forest near Drahanis, doing what 15-year-old girls in rural Czechoslovakia often did on warm August days, grazing cows, working, being young, being alive. Mrazek found her alone. He beat her to death with a stick. He then dragged her body to a more secluded area and committed a sexual act upon it. When her body was found, there was no immediate connection made to any larger pattern. She was a 15-year-old girl, beaten to death in a forest. The investigation was local, limited, and eventually ran cold. Mrazek's first kill would not be formally connected to his later crimes until he confessed to it himself years later in a police interrogation room. That single fact, that his very first murder went officially unresolved for years, tells you everything about the system that failed to stop him and gives you a small, specific dread about how many others like him might exist right now, in your own time, with the first entry in their own secret ledger not yet attributed to anything. Less than a month later, on September 16, 1951, Mrazek killed again. He was bolder this time, or perhaps just more desperate. He used a pistol. He came across 32-year-old Bronislava Padrakova walking on the road between Jerkov and the small village of Kajis, a settlement that no longer exists on modern maps, swallowed by time and development. He fired 3 shots. She fell. He dragged her body to a nearby stream, committed his atrocity, and dumped her in the water. She was 32 years old. She was a real person with a real life. Things she had planned, people who were waiting for her, a future that Mrazek extinguished because her solitude on that road excited him. The body would be found. An investigation would begin. And it is here that the first great tragedy of the investigation becomes apparent. a horror that investigators, when they eventually pieced it together, described with barely concealed revulsion in their reports. He had a specific type of victim. He had a specific geography, the forests, roads, and rural paths of the Komiatov region. And he had a bicycle that he used not for leisure but for hunting. Mrazek pedaled through that region the way a fisherman casts a line. Patiently, repeatedly, with no particular urgency, because he understood instinctively that time was on his side as long as no one connected the dots. And for a very long time, no one did. What followed those first two murders was not an arrest. It was not even a narrowed suspect list. What followed was 5 more years of killing. After the deaths of Hanna Klubova and Bronislava Pajerkova, something shifted in Mrazek's approach. Not morally, not in any direction that suggested remorse or recalibration of conscience, but tactically. The gunshots that ended Bronislava's life had frightened him, he admitted later, not because he regretted pulling the trigger, but because sound travels. Sound can be heard by farmers, by passing travelers, by anyone within range of the shots. Mrazek was many things, deviant, brutal, morally hollowed out, but he was not reckless in the way that gets people caught immediately. He adapted. He switched to a knife. His next 2 attacks, carried out with a blade, were disasters of execution but revelations of information. Both victims survived. In the first incident, he drove the knife into the woman's jaw, a wound that was serious but not fatal, and that allowed her to escape. In the second, he stabbed his victim 18 times. 18 strikes of a blade into living flesh, and yet every single wound was shallow, the blade not driving deep enough to reach anything vital. She lived. She described her attacker. And here is the detail that would steer the investigation entirely in the wrong direction for some time. The witness described her attacker as someone short, with a thin, almost girlish voice. Investigators, working with the description and the pattern of shallow, somewhat erratic stab wounds, became genuinely uncertain whether the perpetrator was male at all. They began entertaining the hypothesis that the attacker might be a woman. This single investigative misdirection bought Mrazek months of freedom he had not earned through skill but through biological accident. He was simply small enough and had a high enough voice that his victim's honest descriptions misled the people looking for him. He returned to the gun after these failed knife attacks. It was more reliable. It was cleaner. The loudness was a manageable risk if he chose his location carefully. And on June 1st, 1952, he was back on his bicycle, back on the night roads, back in the grip of that compulsion he claimed drove him like a migraine that only violence could relieve. He passed a local pub where a dance was in progress. Young people moving through light and music behind the window glass, a world of warmth and normalcy that was entirely inaccessible to the thing watching from outside. He stole a bicycle from in front of the pub. Apparently the one he had was insufficient for the night's plan, and started riding, looking for someone alone. He found 19-year-old Elena Murmanova. He raised the pistol. He fired 3 times. The first bullet tore through the collar of her coat and skimmed through her hair. The angle wrong, the shot imprecise. The shock of it sent her ducking, which caused the second bullet to tear through the back of her coat rather than her body. The third bullet jammed in the barrel. In that moment, with a weapon that had misfired and a victim on the ground but alive, Mrazek made a decision that investigators would later find deeply instructive. He had already, during the shots, reached a state of physical excitement. With his gun jammed and his victim alive, he simply lost interest in finishing what he started and left. He walked away. She lay on the ground, stunned, uncomprehending, believing in the desperate logic of survival that the attacker had been a teenager with a toy gun. It wasn't until the following morning, when she examined her coat and found real bullet holes, that the reality of what had happened settled over her. But the true horror of that night hadn't finished revealing itself. Murmanova returned to the place where she had been attacked, needing to confirm what she had experienced, needing the physical evidence to make it real. She noticed something on the ground. Marks, drag marks, a disturbance in the earth leading toward a bush. She followed them, and in the undergrowth, she found the body of 16-year-old Marie Dvorokova, who had been murdered approximately 1 hour after Murmanovia's assault. Dvorkova had been left on the road by a friend who needed to return home briefly, left standing alone for what should have been a few minutes, waiting. During those minutes, Mrazek had come across her on his stolen bicycle. He shot her once. He checked the surroundings to confirm no one had heard. He dragged her body to a field. He used a knife to cut away her clothing. He committed his atrocity against her corpse. And then, in a detail so bizarre that it initially seemed like a detail from fiction rather than from an actual police report, he covered his own head with the remnants of her cut clothing and put on her shoes before leaving. The psychological interpretation of that act has never been fully agreed upon. Some investigators saw it as a crude attempt at disguise. Others saw something darker in it. A compulsion to merge with or dominate the victim even after death, to wear her, to be surrounded by her in the immediate aftermath of the act. Whatever the truth, 16-year-old Marie Dvorkova was dead, and the man responsible rode away into the dark wearing pieces of her clothing. The pattern was now firmly established. Mrazek would go quiet for a period, weeks, months. Then the pressure would build again, the headache would arrive, the compulsion would intensify until it was undeniable, and he would get on his bicycle and go out into the forest roads. 2 years passed. He was active in theft, active in other crimes, but the killing paused long enough to give investigators no new thread to follow. Then, on July 14, 1954, the bicycle appeared again on a forest path near Cernus. 16-year-old Jarina Helmikova had arranged to meet a friend in the forest, where she was supposed to mow some grass. She arrived late. Her friend had already gone. She started walking home alone, a 16-year-old girl walking a forest path in the afternoon, with no particular reason to fear, no reason at all to believe that the man who would now be behind her on the path had any particular interest in her beyond the single, lethal fact of her solitude. Mrazek dismounted his bicycle. He called out to her. She turned around, as people do when someone calls to them on a familiar road, the reflexive turn of someone who assumes the world is, in that moment, normal. He shot her in the face. Then he committed the same act he had committed before against the same kind of victim, in the same kind of isolated place. He left, and she was found, and the investigation deepened, and the special task force grew larger, and still no one came close to him. By now, the Czechoslovak authorities had done something extraordinary, something, in fact, that represented a genuine first for the country's criminal justice history. They assembled a dedicated task force specifically for the Komutov murders. They named it after the woman found in the stream, the Bronislava Task Force, and they gave it resources and scope unusual for the era. They investigated approximately 25,000 suspects. 25,000. They detained multiple persons of interest. They seized large quantities of weapons. They interrogated, they analyzed, they pursued. And Václav Mrazek, short, thin-voiced, bicycle-riding, ordinary-looking Václav Mrazek, was never once on the list. He had something that protected him better than any disguise. He was employed. He had a regular job, a settled address, a domestic life. He didn't fit any profile the investigators had constructed because the investigators were, by this point, working largely on instinct and limited forensic capability, and their instinct kept pointing toward someone solitary, someone marginal, someone who existed at the edges of society. Mrazek existed squarely at the center of it, invisible precisely because he was average. He also had information. This is a detail that tends to get lost in the broader horror of the case, but it is operationally essential. Mrazek had acquaintances who worked in law enforcement. He had subordinates at his workplace who had access to information about the investigation's progress. He monitored the investigation the way a chess player monitors the opponent's pieces, adjusting his own positioning accordingly. When it seemed like the search was narrowing geographically or by profile, he changed his method. When he survived a near capture, after one attack on a young girl, he narrowly escaped what would likely have been a violent confrontation with enraged citizens who nearly caught him. He took it as a signal to change location entirely. He moved from Komutov to Kladno, switching jobs, reinventing his geographic context, essentially lifting himself out of the investigation zone and resettling in a new community that had no particular reason to look at him suspiciously. What happened next is so extraordinarily ordinary in its horror that it deserves full attention. On August 9, 1955, Mrazek was walking along a road between Kamutov and Brezhnev when he encountered a couple, 19-year-old Lyubustevkova and 26-year-old Karel Chlifich. They were walking together, which meant there were two of them, which should have been a deterrent, a natural barrier to attack, the basic social arithmetic of safety in numbers. Mrazek did not care. He pulled out his pistol. He shot Karel Chlifich multiple times. He stripped the body of valuables, the theft instinct operating alongside the killing instinct in perfect tandem. He threw the body into a ditch and covered it with vegetation, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew how long the concealment needed to last. Then he turned his attention to Libus. She had been shot at but not killed. She made a decision in that moment. A decision that any rational person would make, a decision that many survival experts would recommend. She played dead. She lay still. She breathed as shallowly as she could. She waited, and when she believed he had left, she stood up and she ran. She ran for her life in the most literal sense of that phrase. Mrazek saw her. He raised the gun. He shot her in the back. She fell and did not rise again. He dragged her body to a nearby field and committed his signature atrocity against it. Two people. One encounter. He had killed both of them in the span of minutes, stripped one for valuables, hidden the body, and then hunted down the woman who tried to survive him. The cold, sequential efficiency of it, the absence of any hesitation, any moment of uncertainty or human recognition, is the detail that most distinguished Mrazek's attacks. He did not panic. He did not rush. He treated the killing of two people on an open road with the calm attention of someone completing a task they had rehearsed. The investigation intensified once again. New resources were committed. New suspects were brought in and released. The file grew thicker. And Mrazek remained outside it, cycling home, going to work the next morning, watching an ice hockey game on the weekend with the same eyes that had watched Lyubustevkova run for her life and calculated, with perfect predatory accuracy, exactly how to end it. There is one more victim who stands apart from all the others in the cruelty of her circumstances, and her name is not widely remembered, but it deserves to be spoken clearly. Her name was Elzbieta Baron. She was 57 years old. She was not a stranger to Mrazek. She was the wife of an acquaintance, a man named Ladislav Baron, from whom Mrazek had decided to steal. He had heard rumors that the family kept a significant amount of money at home. He waited for what he believed was Ladislav's night shift, calculated the house would be empty of danger, and broke in. He was wrong. Elzbieta was home. She looked up at the intruder, and she recognized him, not just as a burglar, as Vaslav, as someone she knew. Her first instinct was not to flee but to name him. She called out his name, the way you would if someone unexpected appeared in your home, the way you would if the person in front of you was a familiar face doing an unfamiliar thing. It was the last sound she made. Mrazek had picked up an axe from the yard before entering the house. He used it on her there and then, killing her in her own home. What followed was among the darkest moments in a file already saturated with darkness. Elzbieta's daughter, Jarmila, was 11 years old. She was in the house. After killing the mother, Mrazek forced Jarmila to help him locate the money and valuables. He covered his face with a handkerchief. When the search was complete, he raped the 11-year-old child. He then left. Jarmila, traumatized, unable to see her attacker's face clearly, could not identify him. He walked out into the November night and was not caught. That was 1956. That was his last confirmed murder. But it was not, as the following year would reveal, his last crime. For 5 years, Vaslav Mrazek had been a ghost with a pulse. 7 confirmed murders, multiple attempted murders, sexual violations that ranged from adult women to children as young as 6 years old. A criminal record that, when the investigators finally tabulated everything, would stretch to 127 separate offenses, burglaries, thefts, sexual assaults. All conducted by a man who, on any given afternoon, could have been your neighbor leaning over his fence to make pleasant conversation about the weather. He had survived near capture. He had survived an enraged mob. He had survived the most intensive investigation in Czechoslovak criminal history up to that point. A task force that examined 25,000 individuals and somehow never once landed on him. He changed jobs. He changed geography. He kept his head down. He cultivated his normalcy the way other people cultivate a garden, with daily attention, with careful management, with a keen eye for anything that might reveal the rot underneath. But Václav Mrazek had a problem that no amount of predatory intelligence could fully resolve. He was, underneath the murderer, still the boy from Svinarov who had learned to steal before he had learned to read past the 5th grade. The impulse to take things, small things, meaningless things, things that were not his and that he did not need, was so deeply threaded into him that it operated almost independently from the rational part of his mind. He stole compulsively and constantly. He stole linen. He stole livestock. He stole bicycles, 6 of them, and numerous smaller items that he accumulated in quantities that turned his apartment into a stockroom of other people's belongings. He stole things of no meaningful value, items that served no practical purpose in his life and that he kept simply because the act of taking them was more important to him than the possession itself. This compulsion was the crack in his armor. All his careful management of the investigation, all his geographic maneuvering and source monitoring and method switching, all of it could not suppress the basic compulsion that had been installed in him before he was a teenager. By early 1957, Mrazek had changed locations again, settling near Libusin, where he had taken a job as a spa attendant at the Nejedlyi Colliery, a working-class establishment attached to the coal mining operation in the area. It was steady work. It was the kind of low-profile employment that suited someone who needed to be invisible. He had, it appeared, successfully removed himself from the geographic and investigative radius of the Komyatov case. The special task force was still active. The file still open. But in Libusin, nobody was looking at the new spa attendant. Nobody had any reason to, until one day in March of 1957, a miner at the colliery injured his hand during work. He went to the locker room during a period when he wouldn't normally be there, and he found Václav Mrazek going through the pockets of his fellow workers' clothing, helping himself to whatever he could find. He reported it to the police, not with any thought of serial killers or the Komyatov murders or anything larger than the simple, local offense of a colleague stealing from the changing room. It was a theft report, an ordinary theft report, the kind that filled police records by the dozens every month. Mrazek was detained. The inspection of his home that followed was, by all accounts, a moment that shifted progressively from routine to astonishing. The officers who entered Mrazek's apartment expecting to find evidence of petty workplace theft found instead an apartment that appeared to have been curated from the belongings of strangers. Virtually every surface held stolen items. Useful things, useless things, things that had no business being in his possession, accumulated like the physical residue of a compulsion that could not be turned off even when turning it off was a matter of survival. The officers cataloged what they found methodically, and somewhere in that inventory, they came across something that changed the entire character of the inspection. They found a hair clipper. It was a small item, the kind that might be overlooked in any other context. But this hair clipper had been reported as stolen from the Baron household. The Baron household, where 57-year-old Alzbeta had been axed to death in her own kitchen, and where her 11-year-old daughter had been violated before the killer walked out into the November dark. The hair clipper connected Mrazek, the spa attendant, the locker room thief, the ordinary man from Libusin, directly to that crime scene. The officers kept searching. Beneath the apartment, in the cellar, in the hollow leg of a table, a hiding place that was clever enough to take some time to locate, but not clever enough to defeat a thorough search, they found a Walther PP pistol. Mrazek had carried a Walther PP through his murders. Investigators had recovered bullets from multiple crime scenes across the Komyatov region. Ballistic analysis was conducted. The bullets matched. The pistol found in the hollow table leg in Václav Mrazek's apartment was the same pistol that had killed Bronislava Padjarkova on a road between Jerkov and Kajis in September 1951. The same pistol that had killed 16-year-old Marie Dvorkova in a field in 1952. The same pistol that had shot Karel Tlyfage multiple times and then murdered Libuš Duvkova as she ran for her life in 1955. The same pistol that had ended Jirina Helmikova with a single shot to the face in 1954. The same weapon, held in the same hands, used against the same category of victim across 5 years and multiple locations, was now sitting in an evidence bag in a police station in Libusan. Mrazek was initially cautious. He admitted to some of the thefts. The evidence for those was directly in front of him, catalogued and irrefutable. But for the larger crimes, he said nothing. He was placed in a cell with another prisoner, a decision made with deliberate strategic intent. The cellmate was a police informant, positioned there specifically to extract information through the casual intimacy of shared captivity. Mrazek said nothing. He was careful, guarded, unwilling to speak to someone he didn't know, operating with the same instinctive caution that had kept him free for so long. The cellmate produced nothing of value. And then the investigators told Mrazek about the ballistic results. They told him the bullets matched. They put the forensic evidence on the table in front of him and let him see, in the specific and technical language of ballistics, that the gun in his cellar was the gun at the crime scenes. Something inside Mrazek broke. He began to cry. Not a controlled weeping, a genuine collapse, the way a person breaks when the last wall falls. And then, through the tears, he confessed. Not just to some of the murders, not just to the convenient ones or the provable ones. He confessed to all of them. Every killing, every rape, every theft. He gave investigators details of crimes they hadn't yet connected to him. He led them back through 5 years of horror with a specificity and recall that confirmed he had been mentally conscious of every act, had processed and retained each one with clarity. He was not dissociated. He was not delusional. He remembered everything because he had never been disturbed enough by any of it to want to forget. It was at this point that the investigation revealed another extraordinary fact about the case, one that illuminated the police failure in a particularly uncomfortable way. At some point during the years of the investigation, a list of individuals to be questioned in connection with the Komutov murders had been compiled. It was a procedural step, a standard investigative measure. Identify individuals in the relevant area and systematically question them. Vaslav Mrazek's name had been on that list. An official, through carelessness or administrative error or simple bureaucratic incompetence, removed his name from the list before the questioning could happen. He was never interviewed. His elimination from the process was not the result of an alibi or an investigative determination. It was the result of a clerical error. The most prolific serial killer in post-war Czechoslovak history escaped questioning in connection with his own murders because someone failed to maintain a document correctly. There is no precise way to measure the weight of that failure. How many of the victims who came after that point might have survived if the paperwork had been handled correctly? The question is unanswerable and therefore permanent. As Mrazek confessed and the full scope of his crimes emerged, investigators also became aware of attacks and crimes they had not yet attributed to him. On those cases, the physical evidence bore the hallmarks of Mrazek's method, the same type of victim, the same geographic range, the same specific nature of the post-mortem assault, but the evidence wasn't strong enough to support formal charges. The official file acknowledged this in measured legal language, noting that additional murders were suspected but could not be proven beyond the standard required for conviction. The 16-volume file, the 127 confirmed charges, the 7 confirmed murders, these were what could be proven. What might lie beyond those numbers is a question that the record leaves deliberately, carefully open. Beyond the murders, investigators documented 14 proven rapes, 33 burglaries and home invasions, 12 instances of linen theft, 16 instances of livestock theft, 6 stolen bicycles, and dozens of miscellaneous petty thefts. It was the comprehensive portrait of a man who had been stealing from the world around him, in every sense of the word, since childhood, who had learned that what could not be earned could be taken, and who had extended that philosophy with catastrophic and irreversible consequences to the lives and bodies of human beings. Mrazek, once he had confessed fully, demonstrated something that investigators found genuinely unsettling in its particularity. He said he hated the sight of blood. This was not a joke or an ironic deflection. He appeared to mean it sincerely. A man who had beaten a 15-year-old girl to death with a stick, who had shot multiple people at close range, who had used an axe on a 57-year-old woman in her own kitchen, said that he found blood unpleasant to look at. The psychology of this contradiction is not easily resolved and has never been satisfactorily explained. What it suggests, at minimum, is a kind of compartmentalization so extreme that the act of violence and its physical evidence occupied different psychological spaces for him, that the killing served a purpose he experienced as distinct from its graphic reality, and that the blood was an unfortunate byproduct of a process he otherwise found satisfying. He was mentally evaluated. The assessment that emerged was not one of psychosis or disconnection from reality. Mrazek knew what he was doing, knew it was wrong in the sense that society would punish it, and chose to do it repeatedly across 5 years anyway. He was not insane by the legal standard of the time. He was something colder and more deliberate than that. The trial of Václav Mrazek was, by any reasonable measure, swift. In a system already prone to efficiency when it chose to be, and facing a case where the defendant had fully confessed to all charges, the proceedings moved at a speed that left little room for extended legal maneuvering. The case against him was not legally complex. The complexity was entirely moral and psychological, in the questions that would not be formally asked at trial because the law does not ask philosophical questions about the architecture of evil. It asks factual questions. Was this the man? Did he commit these acts? Can it be proven? On all counts, the answer was unambiguous. The Walther PP confirmed the killings. The stolen hair clipper placed him at the barren scene. His own confession, detailed, specific, uncoerced, and confirmed against facts only the killer could have known, left no reasonable doubt across any of the 7 murder charges. What Mrazek expected from the trial was, in its own way, a revelation about the depth of his disconnection from consequence. He believed, apparently sincerely, that Czechoslovakia had abolished the death penalty. He did not know, or had convinced himself, that execution remained a legal option. His expectation, based on this belief, was that he would receive a maximum of 10 years in prison. 10 years. For 7 murders. For 14 rapes. For countless other crimes against women and girls and a community of people who had lived for 5 years in the particular dread of not knowing who among them was capable of this, or when the next attack would come, or whether their daughter was safe walking home from school. He expected 10 years, and he was surprised, visibly, unmistakably surprised, in a way that observers found simultaneously absurd and deeply telling, when the verdict came back with the word death. He had built his expectation of the trial's outcome on a false premise and then sat in the courtroom genuinely shocked by reality. It is difficult to know whether this surprise reflected actual ignorance of the law or the particular solipsism of someone who had operated without consequence for so long that the idea of ultimate consequence had become genuinely abstract. He was convicted on all charges. 7 counts of murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, 14 counts of rape, and the full catalogue of lesser crimes that filled out the remaining criminal file. The sentence was death. In the mid-20th century in Czechoslovakia, the method of execution was hanging, carried out at Pankráč prison in Prague, the same fortress of punishment that had seen executions under Nazi occupation and would continue its grim function under communist authority. Pankráč was a building saturated with the history of judicial killing, and it was to Pankráč that Václav Mrazek was transferred to await the end that the court had mandated. The date was December 29, 1957. He was 32 years old. He had been born in a village too small and poor to offer him anything resembling a structured path forward. He had been shaped by violence, deprivation, and instruction in theft before he was a teenager. He had been rejected from the institutions he wanted to join because of his physical stature. He had been exposed, during a formative experience in young adulthood, to the connection between weaponry and dominance, between power and sexual exploitation, in ways that he processed not as warnings but as templates. He had arrived at the worst version of what that combination of influences could produce. And on the morning of December 29, 1957, the state of Czechoslovakia ended it. The hanging was carried out at Pankráč prison. It was fast, by the standards of executions, and there is no record that he spoke any final words of particular significance. What does get recorded in the cold, procedural language of official documentation is that immediately afterward, a death mask was made of his face. It was a practice of the time, applied to significant or notable criminals, a way of preserving the physical record of a face that had meant something. In this case, a face that had meant terror and absence, and the particular grief of families who had waited years for answers and received them only through a confession made after a petty theft in a mind-changing room. The following day, his body was cremated at the Model crematorium. His remains were disposed of without ceremony, without memorial, without any of the weight of remembrance that his victims carried and deserved and were given. His brother Karel had been implicated in some of the thefts. He was not a murderer. His participation was in the smaller criminality that had been the family trade since childhood. He was sentenced to 12 years. That sentence, significant, life-altering, but categorically different from death, marks the legal line between where the Mrazek family's shared criminality ended and where Václav's solitary monstrousness began. Karel had stolen. Václav had killed. The court separated them accordingly, and Karel went to prison while Václav went to the gallows. The case, as it closed, left behind several afterimages that lingered in Czech cultural memory and in the professional consciousness of law enforcement. The most significant procedural legacy was the creation, during the investigation, of the first ever dedicated special task force in Czechoslovak criminal justice history. The Bronislava Task Force, named, with painful inadvertence, after the second victim rather than the first, because the first had not yet been identified as part of the series. That task force, despite its ultimate failure to identify Mrazek before his accidental capture, established a model for how organized, resource-intensive serial murder investigations could be conducted in a country that had not previously needed to think about this in any systematic way. It was a significant institutional development extracted from a devastating human failure. The investigation's shortcomings, the purging of experienced police officers after 1948, the ideological prioritization over investigative skill, the clerical error that removed Mrazek from the questioning list, were absorbed as lessons, though lessons paid for in a currency of lives that no institution can fully account for. Mrazek's case also had a cultural echo that his victims, almost certainly, never anticipated and never wanted. In 1966, 9 years after his hanging, a film was released in Czechoslovakia directed by Petr Šulhov, titled Vra skriva tvar, which translates roughly as The Murderer Hides a Face. The film was loosely inspired by the Mrazek case, drawing on the central premise of a serial killer operating invisibly in ordinary society, whose face and identity are concealed not by any elaborate disguise but by the plain, unremarkable mask of a functional human life. The film received attention and was treated as a serious engagement with criminal psychology in its era. For Mrazek's surviving victims, the women who had escaped, the 11-year-old who had survived the worst night of her life in the barren household, the existence of a film loosely based on the man who had done those things to them is a complexity that art cannot fully navigate and that the law does not address. The case was also documented in the first episode of a Czech crime documentary series called Hrdelní zločiny, broadcast in 2001, bringing the details of Mrazek's crimes to a new generation of Czech viewers for whom the post-war period was history rather than memory. Beyond the institutional and cultural echo, what remained was the community. The Chomutov region, the forests, the back roads, the paths between Jerkov and Kajis, the field where Dvorkova was found, the road where the couple walked on a summer evening in 1955, those places continued to exist after Mrazek was gone. People continued to walk them, cycle them, raise children near them. The fear that had saturated 5 years of life in those communities. The particular fear of a predator whose identity was unknown, who could be anyone, who cycled past you on a forest path looking entirely like someone who had nothing on his mind but the destination ahead. That fear eventually dissipated. Not entirely, not for everyone, and not evenly. Fear of that specific kind does not leave cleanly. It settles into certain families, certain survivors, certain witnesses, and becomes part of the way they understand the world ever after. Elena Murmanova had survived 3 gunshots in 1952 and gone back to the site of her attack the following morning, and in doing so had found the body of Marie Dvorkova, a discovery no 19-year-old should have to make, and one that would have rewired something fundamental about her experience of the world. The women who survived the knife attacks, the one whose jaw was punctured, the one who absorbed 18 shallow stab wounds, carried the physical and psychological evidence of their encounters for the rest of their lives. The young Jarmila Baron, who was 11 years old when her mother was killed with an axe in their own home, and who was then violated by her mother's killer before he covered his face and disappeared into the night. Her experience is a depth of horror that language approaches but cannot fully enter. These women and girls were not peripheral to the Mrazek case. They were its center. The case was their lives, their bodies, their survival, their grief. The investigation was about them. The conviction was about them. The execution was about them in the way that justice, when it functions, is always ultimately about its victims. What Mrazek's case reveals, with a clarity that has not dimmed across the decades, is the specific danger of ordinary evil. Not the dramatic, operatic, obvious evil of someone who announces themselves through behavior that isolates and alarms. The danger of the man who folds his evil so completely into the creases of a normal life that it becomes invisible to almost everyone, to partners, to co-workers, to the investigators building criminal profiles and examining 25,000 suspects without once landing on the man next door. The man who hated the sight of blood and went home to his children after leaving bodies in the forest. The man who rode a bicycle, who liked football, who watched ice hockey on the weekend, who was, in every social context that did not involve a lonely road and a vulnerable woman, simply there, unremarkable, unassuming, and entirely invisible to the people who should have seen him. Václav Mrazek was hanged at 32 years old, having murdered 7 women, having violated dozens more, having terrorized an entire region for 5 years without the basic social recognition that monsters are supposed to receive. He was, until the day a stolen hair clipper betrayed him, just a man with a bicycle and a hidden gun and a compulsion that built to headaches and then to killing over and over and over again until someone finally, accidentally, got in his way. He is remembered in Czech Republic as the most prolific serial killer in the country's post-war history. The record has since been contested by other names, other cases, other monsters who emerged from the wreckage of the 20th century and claimed their own terrible territory. But in the specific years between 1951 and 1957, in the forests and roads of Komodov, there was one name, not known at the time, not spoken aloud in relation to the crimes until March of 1957, that belonged to all of it. 7 dead, dozens violated, 127 crimes, 16 volumes of documentation, a death mask made the morning of December 29th, a cremation the following day, and a region of forest and road that still exists, still holds its paths and carries, the way all places carry their histories, the silent weight of what happened there, and who walked through and what he left behind. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Phantom of the Moravian Roads. The Blood Trail of Anton Skymak, a.k.a. the Revolver Devil of the North. He never knocked twice. He smiled, raised his revolver, and left nothing behind but silence and a body cooling in the grass. Before forensic science, before criminal databases, before the world had a name for what he was already moving, a ghost in a felt hat, drifting between villages with 2 loaded revolvers and a handwritten list of targets in his pocket. Priests, judges, merchants, mine owners, pregnant woman, a teenage baker who simply accepted a ride. He did not discriminate between the powerful and the innocent, because to him every human life was a transaction, and every transaction ended the same way. In 1887, across the forests, roads, and farmhouses of northern Moravia, Anton Skymak, known in the streets as Simak, the most feared curse word in Ostrava, became the most wanted man in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And yet, despite 130 soldiers, dozens of gendarmes, and an entire terrorized region holding its breath, he kept killing. This is not a legend. This is not folklore. Every single body in this story was real. Every single wound was documented. and every single victim deserved better than what they got on the roads and in the forests where Skymac hunted. He was born on the 19th of April, 1861, in Nov Sadi, a small settlement near the town of Odry in Austrian Silesia, a flat, quiet region of modest farmers and modest ambitions, where most men lived and died without ever making a mark on the world beyond their own village boundaries. Anton Skymac was not most men. From the very beginning, his character was shaped by something colder than poverty, something darker than circumstance. He was not simply born into misery. He was born with a hunger that misery alone cannot explain. His early years were ordinary on the surface. He completed 8 years of basic schooling, which for a boy of his background in the 1860s and 1870s was not unusual. He was then apprenticed to learn the trade of cloth-making, the textile craft that defined much of the economic activity of the region. He completed that training, and later, during his years of imprisonment, he would even learn tailoring. On paper, Anton Skymac was a man equipped with skills, with a trade, with everything required to live a quiet and productive life. He chose differently. By the time he was 20 years old, he had already been punished multiple times for theft. Not once, not twice, multiple incidents, multiple punishments, a pattern that announced itself clearly to anyone paying attention. The courts of Austrian Silesia noticed, but in the manner of the era, they issued fines, short detentions, corrections. Nothing that truly disrupted his trajectory. He stole not from desperation, but from disposition. He found in theft what other men found in honest labor: a satisfaction, a sense of power, a transaction on his own terms. Then came the arrest that changed the timeline. On the 4th of May, 1881, Skymac was convicted of theft and sentenced to 6 years of hard labor, to be served at the Myrov prison, one of the most severe penal institutions in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a fortress-like structure with stone walls thick enough to bury sound, perched in the Bohemian Moravian highlands. He was 20 years old when those gates closed behind him. He was 26 when they opened again. Those 6 years did not correct him. They refined him. He studied people. He observed guards, administrators, visitors, patterns of authority and submission. He tailored clothes and watched who wore which kind and what that meant about their wealth. He made acquaintances among other criminals, including a man named Subert, a former fellow prisoner he would seek out after his release. Whatever capacity for violence existed in Anton Skymac before Myrov, it emerged from those walls sharpened, patient, and deliberate. When he was released from Myrov in May of 1887, the machinery of Austrian bureaucratic mercy did everything it was supposed to do. He was escorted back to his hometown of Odry. The mayor of Odry, Julius Gerlich, personally handed him his saved earnings from prison labor, 6 gold coins, and issued him a work booklet, the standard document an honest working man would need to seek legitimate employment. He received a formal warning, the civic equivalent of a stern word. He was then accompanied to the city of Opava for military conscription duty, where on the 12th of May, 1887, he was enrolled into the 9th Battalion of the Landwehr Regiment. At the military headquarters in Opava, he was paid out an additional 25 gold coins, his prison savings held for him by the state. In a matter of days, Anton Skymac had money in his pocket, a work record, military enrollment papers, and every legal path open to him. He spent the money on 2 revolvers. He bought the first from a gunsmith in Opava. Then, from a merchant by the name of C. Dorazil, he acquired a second revolver of similar caliber, 12 millimeters. Both weapons were of the Lefechu's pinfire type, a reliable, robust revolver mechanism well-suited to close-range confrontation. He also acquired ammunition, approximately 30 rounds, and then left Opava for the nearby town of Svinov. He was not looking for work. He was not seeking lodging. He was moving with the focused intention of a man who has already made a decision that cannot be unmade. Friday, May 13th, 1887, a date that carried its ominous weight into the history of northern Moravia, was the day Anton Skymac began. His first target was the parish house in Sleska Ostrava. He had, by some account, prior knowledge that the church safe at the rectory in Moravska Ostrava contained as much as 8,000 gold coins. This was a significant sum, a fortune by any contemporary measure, and it had drawn his attention during the weeks or months before his release when he was still compiling his list. For Anton Skymack, the planning had happened behind prison walls. The execution began on the 13th. He entered the parish house and confronted the priest directly. Father Jan Bitta, a senior consistorial advisor in the church, a man of standing and learning, found himself suddenly facing a short, dark-clothed, barefoot stranger who demanded money with no ceremony, no threat, no build-up, just the immediate barrel of a gun and the demand. When the priest did not comply instantly, Skymack shot him in the stomach. It was cold and immediate. The housemaid and the housekeeper began screaming, and the noise drove Skymack away before he could access the safe. He fled through the streets. Father Bitta survived. The wound was severe but not fatal, and the priest recovered, one of the very few people to survive a direct encounter with Anton Skymack. He later described his attacker as a small-framed man dressed entirely in black, without shoes. The barefoot detail was noted. It struck investigators as strange, almost theatrical, and it surfaced again in subsequent descriptions. The following day, Saturday, May 14th, a body was found in the forest near the villages of Nova Vies and Zabre, not far from the site of the previous attack. The dead man was Joseph Karnowski, a servant employed at the inn known as Use Latiho Kreis, the Golden Cross in Moravska Ostrava. He worked for a man named Hoxtim. Karnowski had been shot and robbed. He had been walking through the forest of Hulviki when Skymack found him. He never had a chance. The shot was fatal, the robbery swift, and Karnowski's body was found by 3 railroad construction workers who had been resting in the same forest and heard the gunshot. The panic that descended on Moravska Ostrava after this second incident in 2 days was immediate and real. But the worst was not yet known, because that same week, the bodies of 3 more people were discovered in the same forest. A married couple, Joseph Major and his wife Ineska, and a carpenter named Ferdinand Baran. All 3 found near one another. All 3 dead from gunshot wounds. The investigation determined that both of the Majors had been robbed. 75 gold coins taken from their persons. Ineska Majorova was pregnant at the time of her death. Ferdinand Baran, the carpenter, reportedly had no money. He was killed anyway. 5 victims in 2 days. A pregnant woman among them. A priest left bleeding on his own floor. The district court president, Rudolf Kubitschek, responded by deploying 130 soldiers from the 1st Infantry Regiment Kaiser Franz Joseph, based in Opava, under the command of Colonel Gustav von Hade von Uendi zu Hadeg. The military fanned out across the Hulviki district in a coordinated sweep. Gendarmes moved alongside them. The forests were searched. Roads were watched. Anton Skymack was already gone. He had slipped back to Odry, the town of his birth, the town from which he had been escorted just days before with 6 gold coins and a work booklet and a warning from the mayor. He arrived there unrecognized, or unconfronted, or both. He approached the home of an old man named František Valkel, a homeowner in Odry who lived alone. Skymack came to his door presenting himself as simply a stranger needing change for a 10 gold note, asking for milk. The old man took out his money, hidden in a calendar, a common hiding place of the era, and when he turned back with the change, Skymack shot him in the head with his revolver, took whatever money was there, and ran into the nearest forest. František Valkel was an old man. He was unarmed. He had no connection to any of the previous victims. He was simply someone who had money and who answered his door. The name Simak, the Czech form of Skymack's surname, became the most dreaded word in the region. People used it as a curse. The Hulviki Hill, where 3 of the bodies had been found, was renamed by locals to Simakovec, Simak's Hill. Newspapers in Vienna, Brno, Olomouc, Opava, and Ostrava were all running the story. The region was in genuine terror, and still Skymack moved. He traveled south to the Sumperk region, robbing in the village of Rudels. Then he crossed into the Mohelnis district. Then he passed through Landsgraun. Between crimes, he visited Lipnik nad Bekvu and sought out his old prison acquaintance Subert. He was not hiding. He was traveling, taking what he needed and compiling. He had a notebook on him when he was eventually arrested, a handwritten list of prospective targets: 13 priests, 2 innkeepers, 2 post offices, 2 mines, 2 judges, 2 factory owners, a mayor, a currency exchanger, various merchants, and others. He was systematic. He was organized. He had constructed a criminal itinerary across northern Moravia and Silesia, and he was working through it. On June 1st, 1887, in the early afternoon, Skymack attempted to ambush a carriage on the road in the Mohelnice district. The carriage carried the warden of Myrov prison, Axman, along with his wife, their 5-year-old daughter, and the wife of the prison director, a woman named Julia Bernhauerova. This was no coincidence. Skymack knew these people. He had served 6 years under their administration. This attack was not random, it was personal, targeted, and deliberate. It failed only because the carriage driver, František Riffler, reacted fast enough to whip the horses and escape the shooting. The carriage fled the ambush zone. No one in it died. But the incident confirmed what investigators already suspected. This was not an opportunist. This was a man with a list. Between June 11th and 12th, he returned to Odry again and broke into the shop of a merchant named Joseph Vladar, stealing pocket knives, stamps, and cash. He had stolen from this same shop before, years earlier, and had been punished for it. He returned now as if daring the town to recognize him. And then came his most cold-blooded killing yet. On June 7th, 1887, a farmer named Joseph Haas was driving his wagon from the village of Palom to the market town of Velask Mazirisai for a regional market day. Near the village of Lesna, he was approached by a 17-year-old boy, Antonin Kazalek, a baker's apprentice from Novi Jisin, who had most recently worked for a baker named František Ripper. Kazalek asked for a ride. Haas agreed. The boy climbed onto the wagon. Somewhere near the road to the village of Priliki, Kazalek stepped off the wagon to continue on foot. He was 17 years old, carrying almost nothing of value. Anton Skymack followed him. He shot the boy in the head with his 12mm revolver, stripped him of his personal identity documents, his small amount of money, and his clothing. He hid the body near a pond in the reeds and undergrowth. The body of Antonin Kazalek was not found until June 18th, 11 days later, when a woman named Anna Mykonkova from the village of Jarinka was cutting grass near the site and discovered the remains. The condition of the body after 11 days in summer heat required formal identification. Skymack used Kazalek's identity documents for weeks afterward, presenting himself as the dead teenager whenever asked for papers. He wore the boy's name like a stolen coat. The killings of 1887, 6 confirmed dead, 1 critically wounded, and 1 carriage escape, were not the frenzied acts of a man out of control. They were the work of someone executing a plan, adapting when the plan met obstacles, and continuing when others would have fled entirely. He had money after each robbery. He had options. He could have crossed a border, vanished into the vastness of Austria-Hungary, or simply found work and disappeared. He did not. He kept going. He kept killing. His downfall, when it came, was not dramatic. It came from a hostel keeper who paid attention. To understand what Anton Skymack created in those weeks of 1887, one must understand the landscape he moved through. Northern Moravia in the late 19th century was not wilderness in the cinematic sense. It was a settled, functioning region of farms, small towns, market roads, parishes, and mining operations. People traveled between towns on foot and by wagon. Forests were common, roads were often isolated between settlements, and help was far away if something went wrong along the way. It was a world of ordinary vulnerability, and into that world, Skymack moved like something the landscape had no name for yet. The panic in Moravska Ostrava after the Hulviki killings was not exaggerated. The city had seen nothing like this. 5 people dead in the space of a day and a half, including a husband, a pregnant wife, and a laborer who had nothing to give. The priest, Father Bitta, had survived, but his survival was luck. The bullet had entered his abdomen and his recovery was long and painful. The fact that he lived became a strange local miracle in a week of absolute horror. The deployment of 130 soldiers was the largest security mobilization the region had seen outside of wartime. Plukovnik Colonel Gustav von Hade von Uende zu Hadegg commanded his men through the Hulviki Forest District with military discipline, sweeping terrain methodically, questioning anyone found on roads without clear purpose. Roadblocks appeared at the edges of town. Gendarme posts multiplied. The local press fed the public daily updates, and the updates fed daily fear. Every stranger became suspect. Every unfamiliar face triggered alarm. And while all of this was happening, Anton Skymak had already moved 60, 70, 80 kilometers away. This was the most terrifying element of his crime pattern. Not simply the violence, but the velocity. He struck, he moved, he appeared somewhere else days later, struck again, and moved again. He was on foot most of the time, or occasionally using wagons and public transport. He did not have a horse of his own. He did not have a network of accomplices. He was a single man with 2 loaded revolvers and a felt hat, and he covered an enormous geographic area in a remarkably short time. By the time investigators were documenting the Hulviki killings in detail, Skymak was already in Odry or Sumperk or Landskrown, sometimes all 3 in the same fortnight. The murder of Antonin Kazalek deserves particular examination, because in many ways it was the most revealing crime he committed. Not the most brutal, though shooting a 17-year-old boy and hiding him in reeds was brutal by any standard, but the most revealing of his psychology. Kazalek had almost nothing of value. A baker's apprentice walking between towns did not carry significant money. He was simply a young man on a road. But Skymak needed his identity documents because Skymak was being hunted, and Kazalek's papers gave him a different name to move under. The killing was not incidental. It was functional. Skymak needed a dead boy's identity, so he created one. He then spent weeks presenting himself as Antonin Kazalek at inns, checkpoints, and roadside encounters. He answered questions using the dead teenager's name. He slept in the same clothes the boy had worn. In a ledger found on him at the time of his arrest, investigators later found the name Kazalek written, alongside notes and the addresses of planned targets. He had incorporated a murdered child into his administrative identity. The notebook itself was extraordinary in what it revealed. Investigators found not a list of past crimes. He admitted nothing during interrogation, but a future-facing document, names of prosperous people, addresses of wealthy residences. The distribution followed a pattern. Religious institutions, legal authorities, commercial establishments, postal routes, mining operations. He had built a geography of wealth across northern Moravia and was moving through it systematically. The list included 13 priests alone, a category of target he had already struck once at the Slezska Ostrava parish and nearly killed. He was intending to go back to that category. He had 13 more circled in his mind. The attempted ambush of the prison warden's carriage on June 1st is a moment that cannot be reduced to opportunity. Warden Axman had overseen Skymak's incarceration for 6 years. The prison director's wife, Julia Bernhauerova, was also in the carriage. A 5-year-old child was present. Skymak drew his weapon and fired at a moving carriage containing a small child because the warden of Myrov was inside it. This was not robbery. This was revenge staged as robbery. The fact that driver František Riffler reacted with extraordinary presence of mind and whipped the horses to safety saved 3 adult lives and the life of a small girl that afternoon. Had he hesitated for even a few seconds, 4 more bodies would have joined the growing count. The press coverage of Skymak's crimes across the Austro-Hungarian Empire was extensive, and newspapers in Vienna, Brno, and Olomouc all carried detailed accounts. But coverage created a peculiar additional problem for investigators. It also made Skymak famous in the way that infamy can become a kind of armor. People who encountered a quiet, short-statured stranger on the roads of northern Moravia were not necessarily going to confront him. The stories in the papers described a man who shot people immediately, without escalation, without warning, without giving any opportunity for reaction. This was accurate, and people knew it. Fear itself became one of Skymak's protections. The detail about his feet, that he was barefoot when he attacked Father Bitta, resonated strangely in the public consciousness. It appeared in multiple witness accounts across different incidents. Skymac, moving through the countryside in worn or discarded footwear, or sometimes none at all, became a figure that straddled the boundary between the criminal and the folkloric. Rural Moravia in 1887 was not far from a cultural world where strange men who appeared from nowhere and killed without warning belonged to a category of dark story told around fires. The newspapers tried to rational him. The people who lived in those regions instinctively reached for older categories of dread. Meanwhile, the true number of his victims during this period requires careful accounting. The confirmed dead from his established timeline were Joseph Karnowski, shot in the Hulviki forest on or around May 14th. Joseph Major and Ineska Majorova, husband and pregnant wife, robbed and killed in the same forest shortly after. Ferdinand Baron, the carpenter, killed in the same location with no money taken. František Valkel, the elderly homeowner in Odry, shot in the head for the contents of a calendar. And Antonín Kezelek, the 17-year-old baker's apprentice, shot near the road to Priliki and hidden in reeds for 11 days. 6 dead. 1 severely wounded. 1 carriage escape that should have added 4 more to the count. And a list in his pocket that suggested his work was perhaps halfway done. What drove him? This question occupied not only the newspapers and the courts of the time, but later, in a strange postscript, the scientific institutions of Vienna as well, because when Skymac was finally executed, his brain was removed from his skull and sent to Vienna for scientific examination. The emerging field of criminal anthropology in the 1880s, influenced by the Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso and his theories of the born criminal, sought physical evidence of deviance in the anatomy of offenders. Skymac's brain was considered worthy of such study. What the Viennese researchers concluded, if anything definitive, has not entered the historical record in specific detail. But the fact of the examination speaks to how seriously the empire's scientific community took this man's capacity for destruction. He was not large. Physical descriptions from witnesses consistently describe a man of small stature. He was not physically imposing. He dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, the clothing of a working man, of someone who should be invisible in a crowd of working men. His methods were not exotic or elaborate. He walked up to people and shot them. He took what they had. He left. The horror was in the simplicity. There was no ritual, no prolonged violence, no sadism of the theatrical variety. Just the revolver, the shot, the robbery, and the road. But there was, in certain choices, a kind of cruelty that went beyond mere efficiency. Killing a pregnant woman and taking her purse. Shooting an old man who was counting out change for a stranger who asked for milk. Following a teenage boy off a farmer's wagon and shooting him in the head for identity papers. These were not acts committed in the heat of struggle or self-preservation. They were calculated, cold, and deliberate decisions to end a human life for a specific, immediate material gain. There was no evidence that any of these killings disturbed him. There was no evidence, in any account of his behavior from arrest through execution, of remorse. He was asked, during his weeks of interrogation at the regional court in Novi Jason, to confess to the crimes laid before him. He refused. He sat in cell number 33 on the 3rd floor, chained in fetters 1.5 meters long, and he said nothing useful. His guards described him as stubborn and defiant throughout the weeks of proceedings. He listened to testimony. He observed the court. He gave away nothing. The judge, the state prosecutor, the defense attorney, they all worked within a formal legal framework around a man who had constructed a framework of his own, one that had no space for confession, accountability, or the acknowledgement of wrong. He wrote one letter near the end, a short note to his sister in Odry. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. It was a farewell from a man who appeared, to the end, entirely at peace with what he had done. The trial itself was a significant event in the region. Held at the district court in Novi Jason, it convened in August 1887 with a panel of 12 jurors drawn from the area, farmers, merchants, military men, craftsmen, and presided over by the court president, Ignac Cebulka. The state prosecutor was Dr. Vinanek. Skymac's defense attorney was Dr. Bernhard Otto. The proceedings lasted 6 days. On the 6th day of the trial, August 19, 1887, the jury returned its verdict after deliberation. The answer came at 8:30 in the evening, before a packed courtroom. Guilty. The sentencing followed immediately, death by hanging. Skymack received the verdict with complete composure. He showed no visible reaction. The observer noted that he heard his death sentence with the same blankness he had shown throughout. The verdict was sent to Emperor Franz Joseph I for confirmation, as was required under the imperial legal framework of the time. The court explicitly declined to recommend any plea for imperial clemency. The Empire agreed with that assessment. The arrest of Anton Skymack did not come through an investigative breakthrough. There was no informant, no trail of forensic evidence, no detective genius that finally cornered him. He was caught because a hostel keeper in the small Bohemian border town of Servina Voda did her job. That is the unglamorous truth of how one of the most feared killers in Austro-Hungarian history was brought down. On the 26th of June, 1887, the Gendarmerie Command Post at Moravska Servina Voda received intelligence that several armed robberies had recently been committed in the nearby town of Landsgraun. The local gendarmerie commander, František Fry, issued an order to all innkeepers and hostelry operators in the surrounding area. Any suspicious strangers arriving in their establishments were to be reported immediately. This was a standard precautionary instruction in such circumstances, a widening of the net across civilian eyes. On the morning of the 27th of June, the hostel keeper Anna Effenbergerova sent word to the gendarmerie post. There was a man at her inn who matched the description of the fugitive. He was quiet, alone, and had been staying there. Gendarmerie Commander František Fry and a gendarmerie sergeant named Geisler went to the inn with fixed bayonets on their rifles. They found the man at a table. He had not fled. He had not anticipated this moment from this direction. In this quiet border town so far from his initial killing ground, they subdued him with the bayonets at close range and searched him immediately. What they found on his person told the entire story. 2 12mm revolvers, approximately 30 rounds of ammunition, personal documents belonging to Antonin Kazalek, the murdered 17-year-old baker's apprentice, personal effects belonging to other victims, the notebook, and the list, that handwritten inventory of prosperous targets across the region, organized by category: 13 priests, judges, merchants, mine operators, postal stations, factory owners, a mayor, a currency exchanger, and others. The arithmetic of a planned campaign. Fry and Geisler had not simply arrested a thief or a fugitive. They had stopped a man who was, by his own documented intention, not finished. Skymack was transported first to the regional court in Krudum, where he was formally identified by Antonin Faltenek, a guard from Myrov prison who had known Skymack during his 6-year incarceration. Additional witnesses confirmed the identification. From Krudum, he was taken under close guard to the district court in Novi Jičin, the appropriate venue given that his most recent and concentrated crimes had occurred in that judicial district. He was placed in cell number 33 on the 3rd floor of the Novi Jičin prison. He was kept in leg irons, chains approximately 1.5 meters long, throughout his confinement. This was not theatrical punishment. Skymack had already demonstrated the capacity and the will for violence, and the prison authorities were not interested in giving him another opportunity. The regional press descended on Novi Jičin. Reporters arrived from Vienna, Brno, Olomouc, Ostrava, and Opava. The trial of Anton Skymack, the man the streets of Ostrava had already christened Simak, and whose name had become the worst insult in the regional vocabulary, was a major public event. It was perhaps the most significant criminal proceeding that part of the empire had seen in a generation. The first formal questioning of Skymack took place on August 12, 1887. He was brought from the prison to the courthouse in a procession of gendarmes with fixed bayonets. The streets were lined with onlookers. He arrived dressed in dark blue civilian clothing, with a soft felt hat on his head. He walked among the armed guards with no visible fear, no agitation, no performance of innocence. The crowd watched him. He did not watch the crowd. The trial opened formally in the courthouse with Judge Ignac Cibulka presiding. Alongside him sat his deputy, council member Hauba, adjunct Dr. Kolicher, and reserve judge Sindelka. State prosecutor was Dr. Vinanek. Skymack's defense was handled by Dr. Bernhard Otto. Court recorders were Dr. Keller and Dr. Neusser. 12 jurors took their places. A cross-section of regional life. Farmers, a retired captain, a miller, merchants, and landowners from towns and villages across the district. The proceedings lasted 6 days. Witnesses testified. Investigators presented their documentation. The notebook was entered into evidence. The revolvers were displayed. The identity documents stolen from Kazalek were shown. Victim after victim was named, their circumstances described, their wounds catalogued. The court heard testimony about the shooting of Father Bitta, about Joseph Karnowski found in the Hulviki forest, about Joseph and Ineska Major, the husband and pregnant wife, and Ferdinand Baron the carpenter, about old František Valkel, shot in the head for answering his door, about 17-year-old Antonín Kazalek, found 11 days after his death in a state of severe decomposition. Throughout all of it, Skymack remained composed. He did not break down. He did not confess. He was described by all present as stubborn and stonily defiant throughout. His defense attorney did what he could within the constraints of documented evidence and multiple witnesses, but the case against Skymack was, as the court transcript would later reflect, overwhelming. On August 19, 1887, the 6th day of the trial, the final arguments were completed. Judge Cibulka addressed the court. Defense attorney Dr. Otto spoke. The jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom waited. At 8:30 in the evening, the jury returned. The foreman delivered the verdict. Guilty. The sentencing followed with no delay. Death by rope. Skymack heard the sentence without flinching. The observers in the courtroom noted the quality of his stillness. He had sat through 6 days of testimony describing the deaths of people he killed, the grief of their survivors, the terror of an entire region, and he showed nothing. He had heard a sentence of death pronounced upon himself, and he showed nothing. His capacity to feel was either deeply buried or simply absent. The priests who later attempted to prepare his soul for death would discover exactly how absent. The verdict was transmitted to Emperor Franz Joseph I for imperial confirmation. This was the formal procedure for capital sentences in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The ultimate authority of the state rested in the monarch, and the court had to certify its sentence through the highest channel. Significantly, the court at Novi Jason explicitly chose not to recommend imperial clemency. The judges who had overseen the 6-day trial, who had reviewed the evidence and heard the testimony, decided that this man should not receive mercy. The emperor confirmed the execution order. The date was set for the 1st of October 1887. In the weeks between sentencing and execution, Skymack remained in cell 33. He wrote a single letter, a brief note to his sister in Odry. No confession, no apology, no acknowledgement of the 6 lives he had taken, the priest he had left bleeding on his own floor, the pregnant woman whose purse he had taken after shooting her. Just a farewell. The prison chaplain, a church cooperator named Anton Pavlik, attempted twice on the morning of the execution, once early in the morning and once just before Skymack was moved to the gallows, to bring him to some form of spiritual reconciliation. He urged him to confess his sins, to make peace with God before the end. On both occasions, Skymack refused. He would not confess. He would not pray. He would not soften the end of his life with the machinery of absolution that the church offered. This refusal was significant in 1887 in a way that might not translate fully to a modern audience. In Catholic Austro-Hungary, dying without religious reconciliation was not merely a personal choice. It was a statement. It marked the person as outside the human community in its most fundamental sense. The priest's failure to reach Skymack was reported in the newspapers. It was noted by the observers at the execution. It was the detail that, for many people who read and heard about Anton Skymack in the days and months after his death, defined him most completely. Not simply a killer, but a man who went to his death refusing to acknowledge that what he had done was wrong. A report in the Czech regional press from the weeks following the conviction noted that street ballad singers at market fairs in August 1887 were already singing songs about Skymack's crimes. The tradition of the murder ballad, the crime pamphlet, the cautionary verse performed for crowds at public markets. One such publication was specifically titled, An Instructive Song About the Robbery and Murders of Simak, sold at market stalls in the region in both Czech and German. The crime had already entered folk consciousness before the body was cold. 200 tickets were sold for the execution. This was not unusual for a public execution in the era, but it bears stating plainly. 200 people purchased entry to watch Anton Skymak hang. Reporters came from Vienna, Brno, Olomouc, Ostrava, and Opava. The execution was a civic occasion, a spectacle of state justice, and the newspapers covered it in detail. What the investigators had assembled, and what the court had confirmed, was the portrait of a man who had used 6 years of imprisonment not as correction but as incubation, who had walked out of Myrov prison with money and a work booklet and immediately spent that money on 2 guns, who had spent 3 weeks in the late spring of 1887 moving across northern Moravia with a handwritten list of wealthy targets and a willingness to shoot anyone who stood between him and what was in their pockets. The preparation was frightening in its methodical nature. The execution of that preparation was frightening in its efficiency, and the trial record was frightening in its clarity. This was not a man driven by passion or circumstance. He had planned, listed, acquired weapons, moved systematically, killed without hesitation, and continued. The only thing that stopped him was a hostel keeper who sent a message. The morning of October 1st, 1887 arrived cold and gray over Novi Jason. Autumn had settled across northern Moravia. The deciduous forests around the town had turned, and the air carried the flat, iron smell of the approaching season. Inside the prison, in cell number 33 on the 3rd floor, Anton Skymak was awake. He had refused twice to speak to the priest. He had refused to confess, refused to pray, refused to perform the ritual of last contrition that the church and society expected. He sat in his irons and waited. The execution was scheduled for the garden courtyard of the prison building, not in a public square as in earlier centuries, but still open enough that the 200 ticket holders could observe. The gallows had been built the previous day, a simple but functional structure, constructed by the executioner Rudolf Seifred and his 3 assistants, who had traveled from Vienna specifically for this occasion. Seifred was the official imperial executioner, and the fact that he came from Vienna for this task was a mark of how seriously the state regarded the event. The judicial commission assembled outside the prison before the execution. It was chaired by a provincial council member named K. Sikora and included the examining magistrate Dr. Johann Heiberger, state prosecutor Vinilek, defense attorney Dr. Bernhard Otto, chaplain Anton Pavlik, and 2 court physicians, Dr. Samuel Pearl and Dr. Ferdinand Burkert. Reporters from multiple cities were present. Approximately 200 spectators had taken their places. Skymak was brought out of the prison building in convict clothing, still in his leg irons. The walk from the prison to the courtyard was brief. He moved through it without visible emotion. Those who watched him described a man who was present but somehow elsewhere. Not frightened, not angry, not theatrical. Simply moving through the final minutes of his life with the same composed blankness he had displayed throughout. As he approached the gallows, voices rose from among the spectators, curses directed at him, contempt shouted by people who had perhaps lost someone they knew to the weeks of his killing, or who had lived in terror while he moved through the countryside. He did not respond. He did not look at them. He walked to the gallows and stood. Executioner Rudolf Seifred placed the rope around his neck. The drop mechanism was engaged. At some point shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning, Anton Skymak fell. The rope caught. For minutes after the drop, Seifred examined him and reported that the execution appeared complete. But the physicians waited. 8 minutes after the drop, Dr. Pearl and Dr. Burkert formally confirmed that Skymak's heart had stopped. The execution was documented as completed. Chaplain Anton Pavlik, the same man who had twice failed to bring Skymak to spiritual reconciliation, then addressed the assembled spectators. He spoke of Skymak's refusal of confession, of the opportunity for repentance that had been offered and rejected, and he expressed sorrow over that refusal. In the Christian moral framework of the time, Dying without confession was dying in an unredeemed state, damned, beyond the reach of intercession. Pavlik's address to the crowd was the closest thing to a moral verdict the occasion provided. The court had provided a legal one. The church, through its representative, now delivered a spiritual one. Both were the same. Those present knelt and recited the Lord's Prayer together. Then the courtyard was cleared. The body of Anton Skymak was left hanging on the gallows for several hours, as was the custom. Then it was cut down. And then something unusual happened. Something that places this case in a specific historical context that goes beyond the events of 1887. The brain was removed. It was extracted from the skull by the physicians on site and packaged for transport to Vienna, where it was to be submitted to scientific examination at one of the capital's medical institutions. This was consistent with the practice of the era's criminal anthropology. The scientific movement, heavily influenced by Cesare Lombroso's work published a decade earlier, which held that criminality had measurable physical markers, particularly neurological ones, that distinguished the criminal from the law-abiding citizen. The brain of a multiple murderer was, in this scientific framework, a specimen of particular interest. The examination of Skymak's brain in Vienna represents one of the last acts of this case, and it is deeply telling of the era in which it occurred. The empire that had hunted him, tried him, and hanged him then proceeded to study the physical matter of his skull in search of an explanation. The world of 1887 was not yet able to articulate what we now understand about antisocial personality, about the spectrum of empathy, about the way childhood exposure to crime, punishment, and institutionalization shapes a developing self. It reached instead for Lombroso, for the idea that you could see deviance in the brain tissue, that violence had a measurable anatomy. What the examination found, if anything, was not recorded in any surviving public document. But the gesture itself, sending the brain of a hanged man to Vienna for scientific study, reveals how much the empire needed this man to be explicable. Skymak had created a region-wide state of terror in less than 3 weeks. He had killed 6 people, wounded a 7th, narrowly missed killing 4 more, including a child. He had done so with a plan, with 2 guns, and with the serene calmness of a man performing expected labor. The courts needed to kill him. The scientists needed to understand him. Neither, perhaps, fully succeeded. The aftermath of his execution reverberated through the region for some time. Street ballads continued to be sold at market fairs in both Czech and German. The name Simak retained its power as a curse and a warning in the local vocabulary for years. The hill in the Hulviki forest continued to carry his name informally, Simakovec, long after the execution had closed the official chapter. The last public execution before Skymak's in Novi Jason had taken place 52 years earlier, in 1835, when a man named Skark, who had committed crimes in the forests near Starojica Lota, was executed in the same town. For half a century, Novi Jason had not seen the gallows in use. The town was unaccustomed to this. The 200 ticket holders who watched Skymak die were watching something their grandparents might have witnessed, something that had returned after 2 generations of absence, called back into existence by the weight of what one man had done in 3 weeks. In Ostrava and the surrounding villages, the emotional residue took longer to clear. People had heard gunshots in familiar forests. They had found bodies in places where they walked regularly. The forest of Hulviki, where 3 of the bodies had been discovered, was not a remote wilderness. It was a place people knew, a familiar piece of landscape that had been converted overnight into a killing ground. That kind of violation of a known place takes time to recover from, perhaps more time than the official proceedings allow for. The victims deserve their names written clearly. Father Janbita, who survived a bullet to the stomach and recovered. Joseph Karnowski, the inn servant, who did not. Joseph Major and his pregnant wife Ineska, who were robbed and killed together in the Hulviki forest. Ferdinand Baron, the carpenter, who had nothing to give and was killed anyway. František Valkel, the old homeowner of Odry, who answered his door. And Antonín Kazalek, 17 years old, a baker's apprentice who accepted a ride on a wagon and was followed off of it and shot for his papers. These are the confirmed dead. 6 people across a span of less than 2 months. in a region that had known nothing like this in living memory. 6 people whose ordinariness makes them entirely real in a way that dramatic crime sometimes erases. They were not figures in a story. They were people who got up on the mornings of their deaths and did entirely ordinary things. Walking to a market, working at an inn, driving a wagon, cutting grass, answering a door. There is something important in the hostel keeper Anna Effenbergerova that should not be overlooked. She was not a detective. She was not a trained investigator or a military commander or a court official. She was a woman who ran an inn in a small border town and who, when told to watch for suspicious strangers, watched for suspicious strangers and sent word when she found one. The 130 soldiers who swept the Hulviki forest did not catch Anton Skymak. The gendarmerie dragnet that spread across northern Moravia did not catch Anton Skymak. A hostel keeper who did her job did. The 2 arresting gendarmes, Franisek Fry and Sergeant Geisler, who entered that inn with bayonets fixed and subdued a man carrying 2 loaded revolvers without incident, deserve their own recognition. They knew exactly who they were going into that room to confront. They had read the same newspapers everyone else had read. They went in anyway. The court proceedings against Skymak were a model of their era. 6 days, 12 jurors, documented evidence, legal representation for the accused, and an outcome confirmed by imperial authority. Dr. Bernhard Otto, the defense attorney, performed his professional obligation. The legal system of the Austro-Hungarian Empire processed this case with the full machinery available to it in 1887. The verdict and sentence were the appropriate response to what the evidence showed. The final days of Skymak's life in cell 33, defiant, refusing spiritual consolation, writing only a brief note to his sister, form the closing portrait of the man. He was 26 years old when he died. He had been a thief since childhood, a prisoner from age 20 to age 26, and a killer for less than 2 months. In the arc of his short life, the productive middle section, the years that might have been occupied by work, family, ordinary human experience, was entirely consumed by incarceration. When he walked out of Myrov prison in May of 1887, he walked out without any apparent relationship to the world he was re-entering except as a target environment. People were resources. Transactions were opportunities. Violence was a tool. And death, other people's deaths, and eventually his own, was simply a consequence of the logic he had chosen to live by. The executioner Rudolf Seifried came from Vienna, built the gallows, placed the rope, and reported the execution complete. The physicians confirmed the cessation of heartbeat. The chaplain spoke to the crowd about the failure of repentance. The assembled reporters wrote their stories. The spectators filed out. The Novi Jason court building was cleared. The body was taken down. The brain was packed and sent east by rail. And in the forests of northern Moravia, in the farms and towns and roads where Anton Skymak had walked with 2 revolvers and a list, life slowly returned to its ordinary rhythms. The soldiers went back to their barracks. The gendarmes stood down from their heightened watch. The innkeepers stopped examining every stranger with quite the same intensity. The newspapers moved on. But the hill in Hulviki kept the name people had given it. Simakovec, the hill of Simak. In the informal geography of memory, where official names are ignored and local ones persist through generations, the dead leave their marks in unexpected places. 6 people died in those weeks of 1887. 1 man was hanged for it. His brain traveled to Vienna and was examined by men in white coats who were looking for something that perhaps no instrument then existing could have measured. The precise location in human tissue where conscience is absent, where other lives register as objects, where the capacity to stop does not exist. They did not find it then. The question, in slightly different forms, is still being asked. What is certain is what happened on the roads and in the forests and at the doors of ordinary homes in northern Moravia in the late spring and early summer of 1887. A short man in dark clothing and sometimes no shoes walked out of the trees or up to a door and raised a Lefechu's revolver and fired. And 6 times someone fell. And he took what they had and kept walking. Anton Skymak, also known as Simak, the revolver devil of the north. Born April 19, 1861, in Novsady, Austrian Silesia. Hanged October 1, 1887, in Novi Jason, Moravia. Age 26. Thank you for being here and joining us through these dark and captivating stories. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share with anyone who loves a good mystery. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I always love hearing where our true crime family is watching from around the world. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop searching for the truth.